Chapter 13 of Held Fast for England by G.A. Henty. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by gracesilvey. Held Fast for England by G.A. Henty. Chapter 13. Oranges and Lemons. There was great anxiety in Gibraltar that night, for the wind was very light and from the wrong direction, and, in the morning, it was seen that the greater portion of the convoy had drifted far away to the east. Soon after noon, however, the Edgar managed to get in with the Spanish admiral's flagship, the Phoenix, of 80 guns, and in the evening Prince George, with 11 or 12 ships, worked in round Europa Point, but Admiral Rodney, with the main body of the fleet and the prizes, was forced to anchor off Marbella, a Spanish town, 15 leagues east of Gibraltar. It was not until 7 or 8 days later that the whole of the fleet and convoy arrived in the port. On the 29th, a transport came in with the 2nd Battalion of the 73rd Regiment, with 944 rank and file. A large number of heavy cannon from the prizes were landed, and several hundred of barrels of powder, in addition to those brought out with the convoy. Great stores of salt provisions and supplies of flour had been brought out, but, unfortunately, little could be done towards providing the garrison with a supply of fresh meat. Had Admiral Rodney been able to remain with his fleet at Gibraltar, supplies could have been brought across from the African coast, but the British fleet was required elsewhere, and the relief afforded was a temporary one. The garrison was, however, relieved by a large number of the soldiers' wives and children being put on board the merchantmen and sent home to England. Many of the poor inhabitants were also taken, either to Barbary or Portugal. While the fleet was in port, the Spanish blockading squadron was moored close under the guns of Algeciras, and booms were laid round them to prevent their being attacked by the boats of the British fleet. An opportunity was taken of the presence of the Spanish admiral in Gibraltar to arrange for an exchange of prisoners, and on the 13th of February the fleet sailed away, and the blockade was renewed by the Spaniards. After the departure of the fleet, many months passed monotonously. The enemy were ever increasing and strengthening their works, which now mounted a great number of cannon, but beyond an occasional interchange of a few shots, hostilities were carried on languidly. The enemy made 2 endeavors to burn the British vessels anchored under the guns of the batteries by sending fire ships down upon them, but the crews of the ships of war manned the boats and, going out to meet them, towed them ashore, where they burned out without doing damage, and the holes being broken up afforded a welcome supply of fuel. The want of fresh meat and vegetables operated disastrously upon the garrison. Even before the arrival of the relieving fleet, scurvy had shown itself, and its ravages continued, and extended as months went on. The hospitals became crowded with sufferers, a third of the force being unfit for any duty, while there were few but were more or less affected by it. As soon as it became severe, Captain O'Halloran and his wife decided to sell no more vegetables, but sent the whole of their supply, beyond what was needed for their personal consumption, to the hospitals. During these 8 months, only a few small craft had managed to elude the vigilance of the enemy's cruisers, and frequently for many weeks at a time, no news of any kind from without reached the besieged. The small supplies of fresh meat that had, during the early part of the siege, been brought across in small craft from Barbary had for some time ceased altogether, for the Moors of Tangiers had, under pressure of the Spaniards, broken off their alliance with us and joined them, and in consequence, not only did supplies cease to arrive, but English vessels entering the straits were no longer able to anchor, as they had before done, under the guns of the Moorish batteries for protection from the Spanish cruisers. Several times there were discussions between Bob, his sister, and Captain O'Halloran as to whether it would not be better for him to take the first opportunity that offered of returning to England. Their argument was that he was wasting his time, but to this he would not at all agree. "I am no more wasting it here than if I were in Philpot Lane," he said. "It will be plenty of time for me to begin to learn the routine of the business when I am 2 or 3 and 20. Uncle calculated I should be 4 years abroad, learning the languages and studying wines. Well, I can study wines at any time. Besides, after all, it is the agents out here that choose them. I can speak Spanish now like a native, and there is nothing further to be done in that way. I have given up lessons now with the doctor, but I get plenty of books from the garrison library, and keep up my reading. As for society, we have 20 times as much here with the officers and their families as I should have in London, and I really don't see there would be any advantage whatever in my going back. Something must be done here some day, and after all, the siege does not make much difference in any way, except that we don't get fresh meat for dinner. Everything goes on just the same, only I suppose in peacetime we should make excursions sometimes into Spain. The only difference I can make out is that I am able to be more useful to you now with the garden and poultry than I could have been if there had been no siege. There was indeed no lack of society. The O'Halorans was perhaps the most popular house on the rock. They were making quite a large income from their poultry and spent it freely. Presents of eggs, chicken, and vegetables were constantly being sent to all their friends where there was any sickness in the family, and as even at the high prices prevailing, they were able to purchase supplies of wine and such other luxuries as were obtainable, they kept almost open house and, twice a week, had regular gatherings with music, and the suppers were vastly more appreciated by their guests than is usually the case at such entertainments. Early in September, when scurvy was still raging, the doctor was one day lamenting the impossibility of obtaining oranges and lemons. "It makes one's heart ache," he said, "to see the children suffer. It is bad enough that strong men should be scarcely able to crawl about, but soldiers must take their chances, whether they come from shot or from scurvy. But it is lamentable to see the children fading away. We have tried everything, acids and drugs of all sorts, but nothing does any good. As I told you, I saw the scurvy on the whaling trip I went, and I am convinced that nothing but lemon juice or an absolutely unlimited amount of vegetables will do any good." A week previously, a small privateer had come in with some mailbags, which he had brought on from Lisbon. Among them was a letter to Bob from the owners of the Antelope. It had been written months before, after the arrival of the brig and her 2 prizes in England. It said that the 2 vessels and their cargoes had been sold and the prize money divided, and that his share amounted to £332, for which sum an order upon a firm of merchants at Gibraltar was enclosed. The writers also said that, after consultation with Captain Lockett, from whom they had heard of the valuable services he had rendered, the owners of the Antelope had decided, as a very small mark of their appreciation and gratitude, to present him with the service of plate to the value of £500 in such form as he might prefer on his return to England. He had said nothing to his sister of this letter, as his intention was to surprise her with some present, but the doctor's words now determined him to carry into effect an idea that had before occurred to him upon seeing so many sickly children among the families of the officers of their acquaintance. "Look here, doctor," he said, "I mean to go out and try and get a few boxes of oranges and lemons, but mind, nobody but you and I must know anything about it." "How on earth do you mean to do it, Bob?" "Well, I have not settled yet, but there can't be any difficulty about getting out. I might go down to the Old Mole and swim from there to the head of the bay, or I might get some of the fishermen to go round the point and land me to the east, well beyond the Spanish lines." "You couldn't do that, Bob. There is too sharp a lookout kept on the batteries. No craft is allowed to go any distance from the rock, as they are afraid of the Spaniards, learning the state to which we are reduced by illness. If you did swim to the head of the bay, as you talk about, you would be certain to be captured at once by the Spaniards, and in that case you would, as likely as not, be shot as a spy. Still, deserters do get out, you know, doctor. There is scarcely a week that 2 or 3 don't manage to get away. I mean to try anyhow. If you like to help me, of course it will make it easier. If not, I shall try by myself." "Gerald and your sister would never forgive me if anything happened to you, Bob." "There is no occasion for them to know anything about it. Anyhow, I shall say nothing to them. I shall leave a note behind me saying that I am going to make an attempt to get out, and bring back a boat full of oranges and lemons. I am past 17 now, and am old enough to act for myself. I don't think, if the thing is managed properly, there is any particular risk about it. I will think it over by tomorrow and tell you what plan I have fixed on." On the following day, Bob told the doctor that there were 2 plans. The first is to be lowered by a rope down at the back of the rock. That is ever so much the simplest. Of course, there is no difficulty about it if the rope is long enough. Some of the deserters have failed because the rope has been too short, but I should take care to get one long enough. The only fear is the sentries. I know that there are lots of them posted about there, on purpose to prevent desertion. Quite so, Bob, and no one is allowed to go along the paths after dark except on duty. Yes. Well, the other plan is to go out with the party that furnishes the sentries, down on the neutral ground, choose some dark night, manage to get separated from them as they march out, and then make for the shore and take to the water. Of course, if one could arrange to have the officer with the party in the secret, it would make it easy enough. "It might be done that way," the doctor said thoughtfully. "Have you quite made up your mind to do this thing, Bob?" "I have quite made up my mind to try, anyhow." "Well, if you mean to try, Bob, it is just as well that you shouldn't get shot at the start. I have just been round to the orderly room. Our regiment furnishes the pickets on the neutral ground tonight. Captain Antrobus commands the party. He is a good fellow, and, as he is a married man and all 4 of his children are bad with scurvy, he would feel an interest in your attempt. You know him as well as I do. If you like, I will go with you to his quarters and see what we can do with him." They at once set out. "Look here, Antrobus," the doctor said, after asking the officer to come out for a chat with him. "If we don't get some lemon juice, I'm afraid it will go very hard with a lot of the children." "Yes, we have known that for some time, Doctor." "Well, Repton here has made up his mind to try to get out of the place and make his way to Malaga, and get a boatload of fruit and try to bring it in. Of course, he will go dressed as a native, and he speaks Spanish well enough to pass anywhere, without suspicion. So, once beyond the lines, I don't see much difficulty in his making his way to Malaga. Whether he will get back again is another matter altogether. That is his business. He has plenty of money to purchase the fruit when he arrives there, and to buy a boat and all that sort of thing. The difficulty is in getting out. Now, nobody is going to know how he does this, except our 3 selves." "But why do you come to me, Burke?" "Because you command the guard tonight on the neutral ground. What he proposes is that he should put on a soldier's greatcoat and cap, and take a firelock, and, in the dark, fall in with your party. When you get well out on the neutral ground, he could either slip away and take his chance, or, what would be better still, he might be in the party you take forward to post as sentries, and you could take him along with you, so that he would go with you as far as the shore, and could then slip away, come back a bit, so as to be out of sight of the farthest sentry, and then take to the water. He can swim like a fish, and what current there is will be with him, so that, before it began to be light, he could land 2 or 3 miles beyond the Spanish lines. He is going to leave a note behind for O'Halloran, saying he has left, but no one will know whether he got down at the back of the rock or swam across the bay, or how he has gone. I have tried to dissuade him, but he has made up his mind to try it, and seeing that, if he succeeds, it may save the lives of scores of children, I really cannot refuse to help him." "Well, I don't know," Captain Antrobus said. "There certainly does not seem much risk in his going out, as you say. I should get a tremendous wigging, no doubt, if he is discovered, and it was known that I had a hand in it, but I would not mind risking that for the sake of the children. But don't take a firelock, Repton. The sergeants would be sure to notice that there was an extra man. You had better join us just as we set out. I will say a word or 2 to you, then do you follow on in the dark. The men will suppose you are one of the drummers I am taking with me to serve as a messenger, or something of that sort. That way you can follow close behind me while I am posting the sentries after leaving the main body at the guardhouse. After posting the last man at the seashore, I can turn off with you for a few yards as if giving you an order. Then I will go back and stay for a time with the last sentry, who will naturally think that the drummer has been sent back to the guardhouse. I will recommend him to be vigilant, and keep by him for some time, till I'm pretty sure you have taken to the water and swam past, so that if the sentry should hear a splash or anything, I can say it can only be a fish, and that, at any rate, it would not do to give an alarm, as it cannot be anything of consequence. You see, you don't belong to the garrison, and it is no question of assisting a deserter to escape. Anyhow, I will do it." Thanking Captain Antrobus greatly for his promise of assistance, Bob went off into the town, where he bought a suit of Spanish clothes, such as would be appropriate for a small farmer or trader. He then presented his letter of credit at the merchant's, and drew £100, which he obtained in Spanish gold. This money and the clothes he put in an oilskin bag, of which the mouth was securely closed. This he left at the doctor's. As soon as it became dark, he went down again. The doctor had a greatcoat and hat in readiness for him, there being plenty of effects of men who had died in the hospital, and as soon as Bob had put them on, walked across, with Bob following him, to the spot where Captain Antrobus's company were falling in. Just as they were about to march, the doctor went up to the captain, who after a word or two with him said to Bob, in a voice loud enough to be heard by the non-commissioned officer close to him, "Well, you will keep by me." The night was a dark one, and the party made their way down to the gate where the passwords were exchanged, and the company then moved along by the narrow pathway between the artificial inundation and the foot of the rock. They continued their way until they arrived at the building that served as the main guard of the outlying pickets. Here 2/3 of the company were left, and the captain led the others out, an officer belonging to the regiment whose men he was relieving accompanying him. As the sentries were posted, the men relieved fell in, under the orders of their officer, and, as soon as the last had been relieved, they marched back to the guardhouse. A minute later, Captain Antrobus turned to Bob. "You need not wait," he said. "Go back to the guardhouse. Mind how you go." Bob saluted and turned off, leaving the officer standing by the sentry. He went some distance back, then walked down the sand to the water's edge and waded noiselessly into the water. The oilskin bag was, he knew, buoyant enough to give him ample support in the water. When he was breast deep, he let his uniform cloak slip off his shoulders, allowed his shoes to sink to the bottom, and his 3-cornered hat to float away. The doctor had advised him to do this. "If you leave the things at the edge of the water, Bob, it will be thought that somebody has deserted, and then there will be a lot of questions and inquiries. You had better take them well out into the sea with you, and then let them go. They will sink and drift along under water, and, if they are ever thrown up, it will be far beyond our lines. In that way, as the whole of the guard will answer to their names when the roll is called tomorrow, no one will ever give a thought to the drummer who fell in at the last moment, or, if one of them does think of it, he will suppose that the captain sent him into the town with a report. The bag would have been a great encumbrance had Bob wanted to swim fast. As it was, he simply placed his hands upon it and struck out with his feet, making straight out from the shore. This he did for some 10 minutes, and then, being certain that he was far beyond the sight of anyone on shore, he turned and, as nearly as he could, followed the line of the coast. The voices of the sentries calling to each other came across the sea, and he could make out a light or two in the great fort at the water's edge. It was easy work. The water was, as nearly as possible, the temperature of his body, and he felt that he could remain for any time in it without inconvenience. The lights in the fort served as a mark by which he could note his progress, and an hour after starting he was well abreast of them, and knew that the current must be helping him more than he had expected it would do. Another hour, and he began to swim shorewards, as the current might, for aught he knew, be drifting him somewhat out into the bay. When he was able to make out the dark line ahead of him, he again resumed his former course. It was just 8 o'clock when the guard had passed through the gate. He had started half an hour later. He swam what seemed to him a very long time, but he had no means of telling how the time passed. When he thought it must be somewhere about 12 o'clock, he made for the shore. He was sure that, by this time, he must be at least 3 miles beyond the fort, and as the Spanish camps lay principally near San Roque, at the head of the bay, and there was no tents anywhere by the seashore, he felt sure that he could land now without the slightest danger. Here then he waded ashore, stripped, tied his clothes in a bundle, waded a short distance back again, and dropped them in the sea. Then he returned, took up the bag, and carried it up the sandy beach. Opening it, he dressed himself in the complete set of clothes he had brought with him, put on the Spanish shoes and round turned-up hat, placed his money in his pocket, scraped a shallow hole in the sand, put the bag in it and covered it, and then started walking briskly along on the flat ground beyond the sandhills. He kept on until he saw the first faint light in the sky. Then he sat down among some bushes until it was light enough for him to distinguish the features of the country. Inland, the ground rose rapidly into hills, in many places covered with wood, and half an hour's walking took him to one of these. Looking back, he could see the rock rising, as he judged, from 12 to 14 miles away. He soon found a place with some thick undergrowth, and, entering this, lay down and was soon sound asleep. When he awoke, it was already late in the afternoon. He had brought with him in the bag some biscuits and hard-boiled eggs, and of a portion of these he made a hearty meal. Then he pushed up over the hill until, after an hour's walking, he saw a road before him. This was all he wanted, and he sat down and waited until it became dark. A battalion of infantry passed along as he sat there, marching towards Gibraltar. 2 or 3 long lines of laden carts passed by in the same direction. He had consulted a map before starting, and knew that the distance to Malaga was more than 20 leagues, and that the first place of any importance was Estepona, about 8 leagues from Gibraltar, and that before the siege a large proportion of the supplies of fruit and vegetables were brought to Gibraltar from this town. Starting as soon as it became dark, he passed through Estepona at about 10 o'clock, looked in at a wine shop, and sat down to a pint of wine and some bread, and then continued his journey until, taking it quietly, he was in sight of Marbella. He slept in a grove of trees until daylight, and then entered the town, which was charmingly situated among orange groves. Going into a fonda or tavern, he called for breakfast. When he had eaten this, he leisurely strolled down to the port, and taking a seat on a block of stone on the pier, watched the boats. As, while walking down from the fonda, he had passed several shops with oranges and lemons, it seemed to him that it would in some respects be better for him to get the fruit here instead of going on to Malaga. In the first place, the distance to return was but half that from Malaga, and in the second, it would probably be easier to get out from a quiet little port like this than from a large town like Malaga. The question which puzzled him was how was he to get his oranges on board? Where could he reasonably be going to take them? Presently, a sailor came up and began to chat with him. "Are you wanting a boat, senor?" "I have not made up my mind yet," he said. "I suppose you are busy here now?" "No, the times are dull. Usually we do a good deal of trade with Gibraltar, but at present that is all stopped. It is hard on us, but when we turn out the English hereticos, I hope we shall have better times than ever, but who can say? They have plenty of money, the English, and are ready to pay good prices for everything. But I suppose you take things to our camp?" The fisherman shook his head. "They get their supplies direct from Malaga by sea. There are many carts go through here, of course, but the roads are heavy, and it is cheaper to send things by water. If our camp had been on the seashore, instead of at San Roque, we might have taken fish and fruit to them, but it is a long way across, and of course, in small boats we cannot go round the great rock, and run the risk of being shot at or taken prisoners. No, there is nothing for us to do here now but to carry what fish and fruit we do not want at Marbella across to Malaga, and we get poor prices there, to what we used to get at Gibraltar, and no chance of turning an honest penny by smuggling away a few pounds of tobacco as we come back. There was as much profit in that as there was in the sale of the goods, but one had to be very sharp, for they were always suspicious of boats going back from there, and used to search us so that you would think one could not bring so much as a cigar on shore. But you know, there are ways of managing things." Are you thinking of going across to Malaga, senor? Well, I have a little business there. I want to see how the new wines are selling, and whether it will be better for me to sell mine now or to keep them in my cellars for a few months. I am in no hurry. Tomorrow is as good as today. If there had been a boat going across, I might have taken a passage that way instead of riding. I don't know, senor. There was a man asking an hour ago if anyone was going. He wanted to take a few boxes of fruit across, but he did not care about hiring my boat for himself. That, you see, was reasonable enough. But if the senor wished to go, too, it might be managed if you took the boat between you. I could carry you cheaply, if you'd be willing to wait for an hour or two, so that I could go round to the other fishermen and get a few dozen fish from one and a few dozen from another, to sell for them over there. That is the way we manage. I could not very well go until the afternoon, Bob said. If you do not go until the afternoon, senor, it would be as well not to start until evening. The wind is very light, and we should have to row. If you start in the afternoon, we should get to Malaga at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, when everyone was asleep. But if you were to start in the evening, we should be in reasonable time, just as the people were coming into the markets. That would suit us for the sale of our fish, and the man with his fruit. The nights are warm, and, with a cloak and an old sail to keep off the night dew, the voyage would be more pleasant than in the heat of the day. That would do for me very well, Bob said. Nothing could be better. What charge would you make for taking me across and bringing me back tomorrow? At what time would you want to return, senor? It would matter little. I should be done with my business at noon, but I should be in no hurry. I could wait until evening, if that would suit you better. And we might bring other passengers back in any cargo we pick up? Yes, so that you do not fill the boat so full that there would be no room for me to stretch my legs. Would the senor think $4 too much? There will be my brother and myself, and it will be a long row. It is dear, Bob said decidedly, but I will give you $3, and, if everything passes to my satisfaction, maybe I will make up the other $1. Agreed, senor. I will see if I can find the man who was here, asking for a boat for his fruit. I will come back in an hour and see, Bob said, getting up and walking leisurely away. The fisherman was waiting for him. I can't find the man, senor, though I have searched all through the town. He must have gone off to his farm again. That is bad. How much do you reckon upon making from him? I should have got another $3 from him. Well, I tell you what, Bob said. I have a good many friends, and people are always pleased with a present from the country. A box of fruit from Marbella is always welcome, for their flavor is considered excellent. It's well to throw a little fish to catch a big one. And a present is like oil on the wheels of business. How many boxes of fruit will your boat carry? I suppose you could take 20 and still have room to row. 30, sir. That is the boat, and he pointed to one moored against the quay. She was about 20 feet long, with the mast carrying a good-sized sail. Very well, then. I will hire the boat for myself. I will give you $6, and another $1 for drink money, if all goes pleasantly. You must be ready to come back tomorrow evening, or the first thing next morning, if it should suit you to stay till then. You can carry what fish you can get to Malaga, and may take in a return cargo, if you can get one. That will be extra profit for yourselves, but you and your brother must agree to carry down the boxes of fruit and put them on board here. I am not going to pay porters for that. At what time will you start? Shall we say 6 o'clock, senor? That will suit me very well. You can come up with me now and bring the fruit down and put it on board, or I will be down here at 5 o'clock, and you can go up and get it then. The man thought for a moment. I would rather do it now, senor, if it makes no difference to you. Then we can have our evening meals at home with our families, and come straight down here and start. Very well, fetch your brother, and then we will set about the matter at once, as I have got to go out to my farm and make some arrangements, and tell them that they may not see me again for 3 days. In 2 or 3 minutes the fisherman came back, with his brother. Bob went with them to a trader in fruit, and bought 20 boxes of lemons and 10 of oranges, and saw them carried down and put on board. Then he handed $1 to the boatman. Get a loaf of white bread, and a nice piece of cooked meat, and a couple of bottles of good wine, and put them on board. We shall be hungry before morning. I will be here at a few minutes before 6. Highly satisfied with the good fortune that had enabled him to get the fruit on board without the slightest difficulty, Bob returned into the town. It was but 11 o'clock now, So, having had but a short sleep the night before, and no prospect of sleep the next night, he walked a mile along the road by the sea, then turned off among the sand-hills and slept till 4 in the afternoon, after which he returned to Marbella and partook of a hearty meal. Having finished this, he strolled out, and was not long in discovering a shop where arms were sold. Here he bought a brace of long, heavy pistols, and 2 smaller ones, with powder and bullets, and also a long knife. They were all made into a parcel together, and, on leaving the shop, he bought a small bag. Then he went a short distance out of the town again, carefully loaded the 4 pistols, and placed them and the knife in the bag. As he went back, the thought struck him that the voyage might probably last longer than they expected, and, buying a basket, he stored it with another piece of meat, 3 loaves, and 2 more bottles of wine, and gave it to a boy to carry down to the boat. It was a few minutes before 6 when he got there. The 2 sailors were standing by the boat, and a considerable pile of fish in the bow showed that they had been successful in getting a consignment from the other fishermen of the port. They looked surprised at the second supply of provisions. "Why, senor, we have got the things you ordered." Yes, I do not doubt that, but I've heard before now of headwinds springing up, and boats not being able to make their passage and being blown off land, and I am not fond of fasting. I dare say you won't mind eating tomorrow anything that is not consumed by the time you reach port." "We will undertake that, senor," the man said, laughing, highly satisfied at the liberality of their employer. "Is there wind enough for the sail?" Bob asked, as he stepped into the stern of the boat. "It is very light, senor, but I dare say it will help us a bit. We shall get out the oars." "I will take the helm if you sail," Bob said. "You can tell me which side to push it. It will be an amusement and keep me awake." The sun was just setting as they started. There was scarcely a breath of wind. The light breeze that had been blowing during the day had dropped with the sun, and the evening breeze had not yet sprung up. The 2 fishermen rowed, and the boat went slowly through the water, for the men knew that they had a long row before them, and were by no means inclined to exert themselves, especially as they hoped that, in a short time, they would get wind enough to take them on their way without the oars. Bob chatted with them until it became dark. As soon as he was perfectly sure that the boat could not be seen from the land, he quietly opened his bag and changed the conversation. "My men," he said, "I wonder that you are content with earning small wages here, when you could get a lot of money by making a trip occasionally round to Gibraltar with fruit. It would be quite easy, for you could keep well out from the coast till it became dark, and then row in close under the rock, and keep along round the point and into the town without the least risk of being seen by any of our cruisers. You talked about making money by smuggling in tobacco from there, but that is nothing to what you could get by taking fruit into Gibraltar. These oranges cost $1.50 a box, and they would fetch $10 a box easily there. Indeed, I think they would fetch $20 a box. Why, that would give a profit on the 30 boxes of $600 or $700. Just think of that." "Would they give such prices as that?" the men said in surprise. "They would. They are suffering from want of fresh meat, and there is illness among them, and oranges and lemons are the things to cure them. It is all very well for men to suffer, but no one wants women and children to do so, and it would be the act of good Christians to relieve them, besides making as much money in one little short trip as you would make in a year's work." "That is true," the men said, "but we might be sunk by the guns going there, and we should certainly be hung when we got back if they found out where we had been." "Why should they find out?" Bob asked. "You would put out directly it got dark, and row round close under the rock, and then make out to sea, and in the morning you would be somewhere off Marbella, but 8 or 10 miles out, with your fishing nets down, and he was to know that you had been to Gibraltar." The men were silent. The prospect certainly seemed a tempting one. Bob allowed them to turn it over in their minds for a few minutes, and then spoke again. "Now, my men, I will speak to you frankly. It is just this business that I am bent upon now. I have come out from Gibraltar to do a little trade in fruit. It is sad to see women and children suffering, and there is, as I told you, lots of money to be made out of it. Now, I will make you a fair offer. You put the boat's head round now, and sail for Gibraltar. If the wind helps us a bit, we shall be off the rock by daylight. When we get there, I will give you $100 apiece." "It is too much risk," one of the men said after a long pause. "There is no risk at all," Bob said firmly. "You will get in there tomorrow, and you can start again as soon as it becomes dark. And in the morning you will be able to sail into Marbella, and who is to know that you haven't been across to Malaga as you intended? I tell you what, I will give you another $50 for your fish, or you can sell them there yourselves. They will fetch you quite that." The men still hesitated and spoke together in a low voice. "Look here, men," Bob said, as he took the 2 heavy pistols from his bag. "I have come out from the rock to do this, and I am going to do it. The question is, which do you choose? To earn $250 for a couple of days' work, or to be shot and thrown overboard? This boat is going there, whether you go in her or not. I don't want to hurt you. I'd rather pay the $250. But that fruit must save the lives of many women and little children, and I am bound to do it. You can make another trip or not, just as you please. Now, I think you will be very foolish if you don't agree, for you will make 3 times as much as I offer you, every 30 boxes of fruit that you can take in there. But the boat has got to go there now, and you have got to take your choice whether you go in her or not." "How do we know that you will pay us the money when we get there?" one of the Spaniards asked. Bob put his hand into his pocket. "There," he said, "there are 20 gold pieces. That is $100. That is a proof I mean what I say. Put them into your pockets. You shall have the rest when you get there. But mind, no nonsense, no attempts at treachery. If I see the smallest sign of that, I will shoot you down without hesitation. Now row, and I'll put her head round." The men said a few words in an undertone to each other. "You guarantee that no harm shall come to us at Gibraltar, and that we shall be allowed to leave again?" "Yes, I promise you that faithfully." "Now you have got to row a good bit harder than you have been rowing up till now. We must be fast Fort Santa Barbara before daylight." The boat's head was round by this time, and the men began to row steadily. At present they hardly knew whether they were satisfied or not. $250 was to them an enormous sum, but the risk was great. It was not that they feared that any suspicion would fall upon them on their return. They had often smuggled tobacco from Gibraltar, and had no high opinion of the acuteness of the authorities. What really alarmed them was the fear of being sunk, either by the Spanish or British guns. However, they saw that, for the present at any rate, they had no option but to obey the orders of a passenger possessed of such powerful arguments as those he held in his hands. End of Chapter 13. Read by gracesilvey. Chapter 14 of Held Fast for England by G.A. Henty. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by gracesilvey. Held Fast for England by G.A. Henty. Chapter 14. A Welcome Cargo. After the men had been rowing for an hour, Bob felt a slight breeze springing up from off the land and said, "You may as well get up the sail. It will help you along a bit." The sail was a large one, for the size of the boat, and Bob felt a distinct increase in her pace as soon as the men began to row again. He could make out the line of the hills against the sky, and had, therefore, no difficulty in keeping the course. They were soon back opposite Marbella, the lights of which he could clearly make out. Little by little the breeze gathered strength, and the rowers had comparatively easy work of it, as the boat slipped away lightly before the wind. "What do you make it, 12 leagues from Marbella to the rock?" "About that," the man replied. "If the wind holds like this, we shall not be very far from the rock by daylight. We are going along about a league an hour." "Well, stretch out to it, lads, for your own sakes. I have no fear of a shot from Santa Barbara. The only thing I am afraid of is that we should be seen by any Spanish boats that may be cruising round that side before we get under shelter of the guns of the rock." The fishermen needed no warning as to the danger of being caught, and bent again more strongly to their oars. After they had rowed 2 hours longer, Bob told them to pull the oars in. "You had better have a quarter of an hour's rest, and some supper and a bottle of wine," he said. "You have got your own basket forward. I will take mine out of this by my side." As their passenger had paid for it, the boatmen had got a very superior wine to that they ordinarily drank. After eating their supper, bread, meat, and onions, and drinking half a bottle of wine each, they were disposed to look at the situation in a more cheerful light. $250 was certainly well worth running a little risk for. Why, it would make them independent of bad weather, and they would be able to freight their boat themselves with fish or fruit and to trade on their own account. They were surprised at the enterprise of this young trader, whom they supposed to be a native of Gibraltar. For Bob thought that it was as well that they should remain in ignorance of his nationality, as they might have felt more strongly that they were rendering assistance to the enemy did they know that he was English. Hour after hour passed. The wind did not increase in force, nor, on the other hand, did it die away. There was just enough to keep the sail full and take much of the weight of the boat off the arms of the rowers. The men, knowing the outline of the hills, were able to tell what progress they were making, and told Bob when they were passing Estepona. 2 or 3 times there was a short pause for the men to have a draught of wine. With that exception, they rowed on steadily. "It will be a near thing, senor," one of them said towards morning. "The current counts for 3 or 4 miles against us. If it hadn't been for that, we should certainly have done it. As it is doubtful." "I think we are about a mile offshore, are we not?" Bob asked. "That is about the distance I want to keep. If there are any cruisers, they are sure to be further out than that, and as for Santa Barbara, if they see us and take the trouble to fire at us, there is not much chance of their hitting such a mark as this a mile away. Besides, almost all their guns are on the land side." The men made no reply. To them, the thought of being fired at by big guns was much more alarming than that of being picked up by a cruiser of their own nation. Although they saw there might be a good deal of difficulty in persuading the authorities that they had taken part, perforce, in the attempt to get fruit into the beleaguered garrison. Daylight was just beginning to break when one of the fishermen pointed out a dark mass inshore, but somewhat ahead of them. "That is Santa Barbara," he said. They had already for some time made out the outline of the rock, and Bob gazed anxiously seaward, but could as yet see no signs of the enemy's cruisers. "Row away, lads," he said. "They won't see us for some time, and, in another half-hour, we shall be safe." The Spaniards bent to their oars with all their strength now, from time to time looking anxiously over their shoulders at the fort. Rapidly the daylight stole across the sky, and they were just opposite Santa Barbara when a gun boomed out, and a shot flew over their heads and struck the water, a quarter of a mile beyond them. With a yell of fear, the 2 Spaniards threw themselves at the bottom of the boat. "Get up, you fools!" Bob shouted. "You will be no safer down there than if you were rowing. If a shot strikes her, she will be smashed up, whether you are rowing or lying down. If you stay there, it will be an hour before we get out of range of their guns, while, if you row like men, we shall get further and further away every minute and be safe in a quarter of an hour." It was only, however, after he threatened to shoot them, if they did not set to work again, that the Spaniards resumed their oars. But when they did, they rowed desperately. Another shot from the fort struck the water a short distance astern, exciting a fresh yell of agony from the men. "There, you see," Bob said. "If you hadn't been sending her faster through the water, that would have hit us. Ah, they are beginning from that sloop out at sea." This was a small craft that Bob had made out, as the light increased, 1.5 miles seaward. She had changed her course and was heading in their direction. Retaining his hold of his pistols, Bob moved forward, put out a spare oar, and set to row. Shot after shot came from the fort and several from the sloop, but a boat at that distance presents but a small mark, and, although a shot went through the sail, none struck her. Presently a gun boomed out ahead of them, high in the air, and a shot fell near the sloop, which at once hauled her wind and stood out to sea. "We have got rid of her," Bob said, "and we are 1.5 miles from the fort now. You can take it easy, men. They won't waste many more shot upon us." Indeed, only one more gun was fired by the Spaniards, and then the boat pursued her course unmolested, Bob returning to his seat at the helm. "They will be on the lookout for us as we go back," one of the Spaniards said. "They won't see in the dark," Bob replied. "Besides, as likely as not, they will think that you are one of the rock fishing boats that has ventured out too far and failed to get back by daylight." Once out of the reach of the shot from the fort, the sailors laid in their oars, having been rowing for more than 10 hours, and the boat glided along quietly, at a distance of a few hundred feet from the foot of the cliff. "Which are you going to do?" Bob asked him. "Take $50 for your fish, or sell them for what you can get for them?" The fishermen at once said they would take the $50 for, although they had collected all that had been brought in by the other fishermen, amounting to some 500 pounds in weight. They could not imagine that fish, for which they would not have got more than $10 at the outside, at Malaga, could sell for 50 at Gibraltar. As they rounded Europa Point, there was a hail from above, and looking up, Bob saw Captain O'Halloran and the doctor. "Hello, Bob!" "Hello," Bob shouted back, and waved his hat. "All right, Bob?" "All right. I have got 30 boxes." "Hurrah!" the doctor shouted, waving his hat over his head. "We will meet you at the New Mole." "That is something like a boy, Gerald." "It is all very well for you," Captain O'Halloran said. "You are not responsible for him, and you are not married to his sister." "Put yourself in the way of a cannonball, Gerald, and I will be married to her a week after, if she will have me." His companion laughed. "It is all very well, Teddy, but it is just as well for you that you did not show your face up at the house during the last 3 days. It is not Bob who has been blamed. It has been entirely you and me, especially you. The moment she read his letter, she said at once that you were at the bottom of it, and that it never would have entered Bob's mind to do such a mad thing, if you had not put him up to it. And of course, when I came back from seeing you, and said that you admitted that you knew what he was doing, it made the case infinitely worse. It will be a long time before she takes you into favor again." "About an hour," the doctor said calmly. "As soon as she finds that Bob has come back again with the fruit, and that he has as good as saved the lives of scores of women and children, she will be so proud of him that she will greet me as part author of the credit he has gained. Though really, as I told you, I had nothing to do with it except that, when I saw that Bob had made up his mind to try, whether I helped him or not, I thought it best to help him as far as I could to get away. Now, we must get some porters to carry the boxes up to your house, or wherever he wants them set. Ah, here's the governor. He will be pleased to hear that Bob has got safely back." Captain O'Halloran had, when he found Bob's letter in his room on the morning after he had left, felt it his duty to go to the town's major office to mention his absence, and it had been reported to the general, who had sent for Gerald to inquire about the circumstances of the lad's leaving. Captain O'Halloran had assured him that he knew nothing whatever of his intention, and that it was only when he found the letter on his table, saying that he had made up his mind to get beyond the Spanish lines somehow, and to bring in a boatload of oranges for the use of the women and children who were suffering from scurvy, that he knew his brother-in-law had any such idea in his mind. "It is a very gallant attempt, Captain O'Halloran, although, of course, I should not have permitted it to be made, had I been aware of his intentions." "Nor should I, sir," Captain O'Halloran said. "My wife is naturally very much upset." "That is natural enough," the governor said. "Still, she has every reason to be proud of her brother. A man could risk his life for no higher object than that for which Mr. Repton has undertaken this expedition." "How do you suppose he got away?" "I have no idea, sir. He may have got down by ropes from the back of the rock, the way the deserters generally choose." "Yes, but if he got down without breaking his neck, he would still have to pass our lines of sentries, and also through the Spaniards. He is a very good swimmer, General, and may have struck out and landed beyond the Spanish forts. Of course, he may have started from the old mole and swam across to the head of the bay. He is sure to have thought the matter well out. He is very sharp, and, if anyone could get through, I should say Bob could. He speaks the language like a native." "I have heard of him before," the governor said, smiling. "Captain Langton told us of the boy's doings when he was away in that privateer brig, and how he took him the frigate, and was the means of the brig capturing those 2 valuable prizes, and how he had swam on board a Spanish sloop of war. He said that no officer could have shown greater pluck and coolness. I sincerely hope that no harm will come to him, but how, even if he succeeds in getting through the Spanish lines, he can manage single-handed to get back here in a boat is more than I can see. Well, I sincerely trust that no harm will come to him." As the governor, with 2 or 3 of his staff, now came along, Captain O'Halloran went up to him. "I am glad to say, sir," he said, "that young Repton has just returned, and that he has brought in 30 cases of fruit." I am extremely glad to hear it, Captain O'Halloran, the governor said warmly. When it was reported to me an hour since that the Spanish fort and one of their cruisers were firing at a small boat that was making her way in from the east, the thought struck me that it might be your brother-in-law. Where is he? He is just coming round to the mole, sir. Dr. Burke and myself are going to meet him. I will go down with you, the governor said. Those oranges are worth 1,000 pounds a box to the sick. The party reached the mole before the boat came in, for after rounding the point she had been becalmed, and the fishermen had lowered the sail and betaken themselves to their oars again. Bob felt a little uncomfortable when, as the boat rowed up to the landing stairs, he saw General Elliot with a group of officers standing at the top. He was relieved when, on ascending the steps, the governor stepped forward and shook him warmly by the hand. I ought to begin by scolding you for breaking out of the fortress without leave, but I am too pleased with the success of your venture and too much gratified at the spirit that prompted you to undertake it to say a word. Captain O'Halloran tells me that you have brought in 30 cases of fruit. Yes, sir. I have 10 cases of oranges and 20 of lemons. I propose, with your permission, to send half of these up to the hospitals for the use of the sick there. The others I intend for the use of the women and children of the garrison and townspeople. Dr. Burke will see for me that they are distributed where they will do most good. Well, my lad, I thank you most cordially for your noble gift to the troops, and there is not a man here who will not feel grateful to you for the relief it will afford to the women and children. I shall be very glad if you will dine with me today, and you can then tell me how you managed what I thought, when I first heard of your absence, was a sheer impossibility. Captain O'Halloran, I trust that you and Mrs. O'Halloran will also give me the pleasure of your company at dinner today. If you please, sir, Bob said. Will you give these 2 boatmen a pass, permitting them to go out after dark tonight? I promised them that they should not be detained. It is of the greatest importance to them that they should get back before their absence is discovered. Certainly, the governor said, and at once ordered one of the officers of the staff to see that the pass was given, and orders issued to the officers of the batteries to allow the boat to pass out in the dark unquestioned. As soon as the governor walked away with his staff, Bob was heartily greeted by Captain O'Halloran and the doctor. You have given us a fine fright, Bob, the former said, and your sister has been in a desperate way about you. However, now that you have come back safe, I suppose she will forgive you. But what about all those fish? Are they yours? Why, there must be half a ton of them. No, the men say there are 500 or 600 pounds. Yes, they are mine. I thought of keeping a few for ourselves, and dividing the rest between the 10 regiments, and sending them up with your compliments to their messes. Not with my compliments, Bob. That would be ridiculous. Send them up with your own compliments. It will be a mighty acceptable present, but you had better pick out 2 or 3 of the finest fish, and send them up to the governor. Now then, let us set to work. Here are plenty of porters, but, first of all, we had better get 10 men from the officer of the guard here, and send one off with each of the porters with the fish to the regiments, or the chances are that these baskets will be a good bit lighter by the time they arrive there than when they start. I will go and ask the officer while you are getting the fish up here and divided. In a quarter of an hour the 10 porters started, each with about half a hundredweight, and under the charge of a soldier. The doctor took charge of the porters with the 15 boxes of fruit for the various hospitals, and then, after Bob had paid the boatmen the $250 due to them, and had told them that they would get the permit to enable them to sail again as soon as it became dark, he and Captain O'Halloran started for the house, with the men in charge of the other 15 boxes, and with one carrying the remaining fish, which weighed about the same as the other parcels. How did you and the doctor happen to be at Europa Point, Gerald? Bob asked as they went along. The doctor said he felt sure that whenever you did come, that is, if you came at all, you would get here somewhere about daylight, and he arranged with the officer in charge of the upper battery to send a man down with the news if there was a boat in sight. Directly he heard that the Spaniards were firing at a boat, he came over and called me, and we went round to the back of the rock. We couldn't be sure that it was you from that height, but, as we could make out the boxes, we thought it must be you, and so walked down to the point to catch you there. Does Carrie know that a boat was in sight? No, I wouldn't say anything to her about it. She had only just dropped off to sleep when I was called. She woke up and asked what it was, but I said that I supposed I was wanted on duty, and she went off again before I was dressed. I was glad she did, for she hadn't closed her eyes before since she started. Carrie was on the terrace when she saw Bob and Gerald, followed by a procession of porters coming up the hill. With a cry of joy, she ran down into the house and out to meet them. "You bad boy," she cried, as she threw her arms around Bob's neck. "How could you frighten us so? It is very cruel and wicked of you, Bob, and I am not going to forgive you, though I can't help being glad to see you, which is more than you deserve." "You mustn't scold him, Carrie," her husband said. "Even the governor didn't scold him, and he has thanked him in the name of the whole garrison, and he has asked him to dine with him, and you and I are to dine there too, Carrie. There is an honor for you. But what is better than honor is that there isn't a woman and child on the rock who won't be feeling deeply grateful to Bob before the day is over." "Has he really got some fruit?" "Yes. Don't you see the boxes, Carrie?" "Oh, I saw something coming along, but I didn't see anything clearly but Bob. What are these boxes? Oranges?" "Oranges and lemons. 5 of oranges and 10 of lemons. And there are as many more that have gone up to the hospital for the use of the men. There, let us see them taken into the storeroom. You can open up 2 of them at once, and send Manola off with a big basket, and tell her to give 6 of each, with your love, to each of the ladies you know. The doctor will take charge of the rest, and see about their division among all the women on the rock. It will be quite a business, but he won't mind it." "What is all this, fish?" "Well, my dear, you are to take as much as you want, and you are to pick out 2 or 3 of the best, and send them to the governor with your compliments, and the rest you can divide and send out with the fruit to your special friends." "But how has Bob done it?" Carrie asked, quite overwhelmed at the sight of all those welcome stores. "Ah, that he must tell you himself. I have no more idea than the man in the moon." "It has all been quite simple," Bob said. "But see about sending these things off first, Carrie. Dr. Burke will be here after he has seen the others taken safely to the hospital, and I shall have to tell it all over again then." "I am very angry with the doctor," Miss O'Halloran said. "Then the sooner you get over being angry, the better, Carrie. The doctor had nothing whatever to do with my going, but when he saw that I had made up my mind to go, he helped me, and I am extremely obliged to him. Now, you may have an orange for yourself if you are good." "That I won't," Carrie said. "Thanks to our eggs and vegetables, we are perfectly well, and, when there are so many people really in want of the oranges, it would be downright wicked to eat them merely because we like them." In a short time Manola, with 2 of the children from downstairs, carrying baskets, started, with the presents of fruit and fish to all the ladies of Carrie's acquaintance. Soon after she had left, Dr. Burke arrived. "I was not going to speak to you, Teddy Burke," Miss O'Halloran said, shaking her head at him. "I had lost confidence in you, but with Bob back again, and all this fruit for the poor creatures who want it, I will forgive you." "I am glad you have grace enough for that, Mrs. O'Halloran. It is down on your knees you ought to go to thank me, if I had my rights. Isn't Bob a hero? And hasn't he received the thanks of the governor? And hasn't he saved scores of lives this blessed day? And although it is little enough I had to do with it, isn't it the thanks of the whole garrison ought to be given me, for even the little bit of a share I had in it? We have been waiting for you to come, Teddy," Captain O'Halloran said, "to hear Bob's story." "Well then, you will have to wait a bit longer," the doctor said. "I have sent orderlies from the hospital to all the regiments, including, of course, the artillery and engineers, asking them to send me lists of the numbers of the women and children of the non-commissioned officers and privates, and also of officers' wives and families, and to send with the lists here 2 orderlies from each regiment with baskets. I have been down to the town major and got a list of the number of women and children in the town. When we get the returns from the regiments, we will reckon up the totals and see how many there will be for each. I think that each of the boxes holds about 500. The work of counting out the oranges and lemons for the various regiments and the townspeople occupied some time, and it was not until the orderlies had started with their supplies that Bob sat down to tell his story. "Nothing could have been easier," he said when he finished. "It was easy enough, as you say, Bob," the doctor said, "but it required a lot of coolness and presence of mind. Events certainly turned out fortunately for you, but you took advantage of them. That is always the point. Nobody could have done it better, and most people would have done worse. I have been wondering myself a great deal since you have been gone what plan you could possibly hit on to get the oranges into a boat, and how, when you had got them in, you would manage to get them here. It seems all easy enough now you have done it, but that is all the more creditable to you for hitting on a plan that worked so well. Similar praise was given to Bob when he had again to tell his story at the governor's. So you managed, you say, to slip out with the reliefs? The governor said. Yes, sir. I had got a military cloak and hat. Still, it is curious that they did not notice an addition to their party. I fancy you must have had a friend there? That, General, is a point that I would rather not say anything about. That is the way that I did go out, and, when I took to the water, I let the coat and hat float away, for, had they been found, it might have been supposed that somebody had deserted. I wish you could have brought in a shipload instead of a boatload of fruit, Mr. Repton. They will be of immense benefit to the sick, but, unfortunately, there is scarcely a person on the rock that is not more or less affected, and, if your 30 boxes were multiplied by 100, it would be none too much for our needs. The oranges and lemons did, however, for a time have a marked effect in checking the progress of the scurvy, especially among the children, who came in for a larger share than that which fell to the sick soldiers. But in another month the condition of those in hospital, and indeed of many who still managed to do duty, was again pitiable. On the 11th of October, however, some of the boats of the fleet went out during a fog, and boarded a Danish craft from Malaga, laden with oranges and lemons, and brought her in. The cargo was at once bought by the governor and distributed. The beneficial effects were immediate. Cases which had but a few days before appeared hopeless were cured, as if by magic, and the health of the whole garrison was re-established. Heavy rain setting in at the same time, the gardens upon which for months great attention had been bestowed, came rapidly into bearing, and henceforth throughout the siege, the supply of vegetables, if not ample for the needs of the garrison and inhabitants, was sufficient to prevent scurvy from getting any strong hold again. A few days after the ship with oranges was brought in, an orderly came in to Captain O'Halloran with the message that the governor wished to speak to Mr. Repton. Bob was out at the time, but went up to the castle as soon as he returned, and was at once shown in to the governor. Mr. Repton, the latter began, after the spirit you showed the other day, I shall be glad to utilize your services still farther, if you are willing. I shall be very glad to be useful in any work upon which you may think fit to employ me, sir. I wish to communicate with Mr. Logie at Tangiers, the governor said. It is a month now since we have had any news from him. At the time he last wrote, he said that the Emperor of Morocco was manifesting an unfriendly spirit towards us, and that he was certainly in close communication with the Spaniards, and had allowed their ships to take more than one English vessel lying under the guns of the town. His own position was, he said, little better than that of a prisoner, for he was closely watched. He still hoped, however, to bring the Emperor round again to our side, as he had, for years, exercised a considerable influence over him. If he would grant him an interview, Mr. Logie thought that he might still be able to clear up any doubts of us that the Spaniards might have infused in his mind. Since that letter we have heard nothing from him, and we are ignorant how matters stand over there. The matter is important, for although, while the enemy's cruisers are as vigilant as at present, there is little hope of our getting fresh meat over from there. I am unable to give any directions to such privateers or others as may find their way in here. It makes all the difference to them whether the Morocco ports are open to them or not. Until lately, when chased they could run in there, wait for a brisk east wind, and then start after dark, and be fairly through the straits before morning. I am very desirous, therefore, of communicating with Mr. Logie. I am also anxious, not only about his safety, but of that of several English families there, among whom are those of some of the officers of the garrison, who, thinking that they would be perfectly safe in Tangiers, and avoid the hardships and dangers of the siege, dispatched them across the straits by the native craft that came in when first the port was closed. Thinking it over, it appeared to me that you would be far more fitted than most for this mission, if you would accept it. You have already shown yourself able to pass as a Spaniard, and, should you find that things have gone badly in Tangiers, and that the Moors have openly joined the Spaniards, you might be able to get a passage to Lisbon in a neutral ship and to return thence in the first privateer or ship of war bound for this port. I would of course provide you with a document requesting the officer in command of any such ship to give you a passage. Should no such neutral ship come along, I should trust to you to find your way across to Tarifa or Algeciras, and thence to manage in some way, which I must leave to your own ingenuity, to make your way in. I do not disguise from you that the commission is a very dangerous as well as an honorable one. As were you, an Englishman, detected on Spanish soil, you would almost certainly be executed as a spy. I am ready to undertake the commission, sir, and I am much obliged to you for affording me the opportunity of being of service. It is irksome for me to remain here in idleness when there are many young officers of my own age doing duty in the batteries. As to the risk, I am quite prepared to run it. It will be exactly such an adventure as I should choose. Very well, Mr. Repton, then I will send you the dispatches this evening, together with a letter recommending you to all British officers and authorities. Both will be written on the smallest pieces of paper possible, so that you may conceal them more easily. Now, as to the means, there are many of the fishermen here who would be glad to leave. The firing in the bay has frightened the greater part of the fish away, and besides, the boats dare not go any distance from the rock. I have caused inquiries to be made, and have given permits to 3 men to leave the rock in a boat after nightfall, and to take their chance of getting through the enemy's cruisers. It is likely to be a very dark night. I have arranged with them to take a passenger across to Tangiers, and have given them permission to take 2 others with them. We know that there are many Jews and others most anxious to leave the town before the enemy begin to bombard it, and the men will doubtless get a good price from 2 of these to carry them across the straits. You will form an idea for yourself whether these boatmen are trustworthy. If you conclude that they are, you can make a bargain with them, or with any others, to bring you back direct. I authorize you to offer them £100 for doing so. Come up here at 8 o'clock this evening. I will have the dispatches ready for you then. You will understand that if you find the Moors have become absolutely hostile, and have a difficulty in getting at Mr. Logie, you are not to run any risk in trying to deliver the dispatches, as the information you will be able to obtain will be sufficient for me, without any confirmation from him. After further conversation, Bob took his leave of the governor. On his return home, Carrie was very vexed when she heard the mission that Bob had undertaken, and at first it needed all of her husband's persuasions to prevent her going off to the governor's to protest against it. Why, my dear, you would make both yourself and Bob ridiculous. Surely he is of an age now to go his own way without petticoat government. He has already gained great credit, both in his affair with the privateer and in fetching in the oranges the other day. This is far less dangerous. Here he has only got to smuggle himself in. There he had to bring back something like a ton of oranges. It is a great honor for the governor to have chosen him, and as to you opposing it, the idea is absurd. I shall go round to Major Harcourt, Bob said. Mrs. Harcourt is terribly anxious about her daughter, and I am sure she will be glad to send a letter over to her. Carrie, Captain O'Halloran said gravely, I have become a sudden convert to your opinion regarding this expedition. Suppose that Bob, instead of coming back, were to carry Amy Harcourt off to England. It would be terrible. I believe that Mr. Logie, as His Majesty's consul, could perform the necessary ceremony before they sailed. Bob laughed. I should doubt whether Mr. Logie would have power to officiate in the case of minors. Besides, there is an English church where the banns could be duly published. No, I think we must put that off, Gerald. Amy Harcourt was the daughter of one of the O'Halloran's most intimate friends, and the girl, who was about 13 years old, was often at their house with her mother. She had suffered much from the heat early in June, and her parents had, at a time when the Spanish cruisers had somewhat relaxed their vigilance, sent her across to Tangiers in one of the traders. She was in the charge of Mrs. Cullum, the wife of an officer of the regiment, who was also going across for her health. They intended to stay at Tangiers only for a month or 6 weeks, but Mrs. Cullum had become worse, and was, when the last news came across, too ill to be moved. Major and Mrs. Harcourt had consequently become very anxious about Amy, the feeling being much heightened by the rumors of the hostile attitude of the Emperor towards the English. Mrs. Harcourt gladly availed herself of the opportunity that Bob's mission offered. "I shall be glad indeed if you will take a letter, Mr. Repton. I am in great trouble about her. If anything should happen to Mrs. Cullum, her position would be extremely awkward. I know that Mr. Logie will do the best he can for her, but, for aught we know, he and all the English there may, at present, be prisoners among the Moors. I need not say how bitterly her father and I have regretted that we let her go, and yet it seemed by far the best thing at the time, for she would get an abundance of fresh meat, food, and vegetables. Of course, you will see how she is situated when you get there, and I am sure you will give her the best advice you can as to what she is to do. Not knowing how they are placed there, we can do literally nothing, and you manage that fruit business so splendidly that I feel very great confidence in you." "I am sure I shall be glad to do anything that I can, Mrs. Harcourt, and if it had been a boy, I dare say we could have managed something between us, but you see, girls are different." "Oh, you won't find any difficulty with her. I often tell her she is as much of a boy at present as she is a girl. Amy has plenty of sense. I shall tell her in my letter about your going out to fetch in the fruit for the women and children. She is inclined to look up to you very much already, owing to the share you had in the capture of those Spanish vessels, and I am sure she will listen to any advice you give her." "Well, I will do my best, Mrs. Harcourt," Bob said meekly, "but I have never had anything to do with girls except my sister, and she gives the advice always, and not me." "By what she says, Bob, I don't think you always take it," Mrs. Harcourt said, smiling. "Well, not quite always," Bob admitted. "Women are constantly afraid that you are going to hurt yourself or something, just as if a boy had got no sense." "Well, I will do what I can, Mrs. Harcourt. I am sure I hope that I shall find them all right over there." "I hope so too," Mrs. Harcourt said. "I will see Captain Cullum. He will be sure to give you a letter for his wife. I shall talk it over with him, and, if he thinks that she had better go straight home, if any opportunity offers, I shall tell Amy to go with her and stay with my sister at Gloucester till the siege is over, and then she can come out again to us. I will bring you down the letters myself at 7 o'clock. From her, Bob went to Dr. Burke. "I have just come from your house, Bob. I found your sister in a despondent state about you. I assured her you had as many lives as a cat, and could only be considered to have used up 2 or 3 of them yet, and were safe for some years to come. I hinted that you had more to fear from a rope than either drowning or shooting. That made her angry, and did her good. However, it was better for me to be off, and I thought most likely that you would be coming round for a talk." "So you are going officially this time? Well, what disguise are you going to take?" "That is what I have been thinking of. What would you recommend, Doctor?" "Well, the choice is not a very extensive one. You can hardly go as you are, because if the Moors have joined the Spaniards, you would be arrested as soon as you landed. Gerald tells me that probably 2 of the Jew traders will go away with you. If so, I should say you could not do better than dress in their style. There are many of them rock scorpions, and talk Spanish and English equally well, but I should say that you had better take another disguise." "That is what I was thinking," Bob said. "The boatman will know that I have something to do with the governor, and the 2 Jews will certainly know that I don't belong to the rock. If they find that the Moors have joined the Spaniards, these Jews may try to get through themselves by denouncing me. I should say I had better get clothes with which I can pass as a Spanish sailor or fisherman. There are almost sure to be Spanish ships in there. There is a good deal of trade between Tangiers and Spain. Then again, I shall want my own clothes if I have to take a passage in a neutral to Lisbon. So I should say that I had better go down to the town and get a sort of trader's suit and a fisherman's at one of the low slop shops. Then I will go as a trader to start with, and carry the other 2 suits in a bag." "That will be a very good plan, Bob. You are not likely to be noticed much when you land. There are always ships anchored there, waiting for a wind to carry them out. They must be accustomed to sailors of all sorts of nationalities in the streets. However, I hope you will find no occasion for any clothes after you land but your own. The Moors have always been good friends of ours, and the Emperor must know that the Spaniards are very much more dangerous neighbors than we are, and I can hardly believe he will be fool enough to throw us over. I will go down with you to buy these things." Bob had no difficulty in procuring the clothes he required at a second-hand shop, and then took the lot home with him. Carrie had by this time become more reconciled to what could not be avoided, and she laughed when Dr. Burke came in. "You are like a bad penny, Teddy Burke. It is no use trying to get rid of you." "Not the least bit in the world, Mrs. O'Halloran. Fortunately, I know that, however hard you are upon me, you don't mean what you say." "I do mean it very much, but after you are gone I say to myself, it is only Teddy Burke, and think no more of it." That evening at 9 o'clock, Bob embarked on board the fishing boat at the New Mole. One of the governor's aides de camp accompanied him, to pass him through all the guards, and orders had been sent to the officers in command of the various batteries that the boat was not to be challenged. It was to show a light from a lantern as it went along, in order that it might be known. The other 2 passengers and the boatmen had been sitting there since before gunfire, and they were glad enough when Bob came down and took his seat in the stern, taking the tiller ropes. The oars had been muffled, and they put off noiselessly. When they got past River Point, they found a light breeze blowing, and at once laid in their oars and hoisted sail. A vigilant lookout was kept. Once or twice they thought they made out the hulls of anchored vessels, but they gave these a wide berth, and, when the morning broke, were halfway across the strait, heading directly for Tangiers. In another 6 hours they entered the port. There were half a dozen vessels lying in the harbor. 4 of these were flying Spanish colors. One was a Dane, and the other a Dutchman. From the time morning broke, Bob had been narrowly examining his fellow passengers and the boatmen, and came to the conclusion that none of them were to be trusted. As soon as he stepped ashore with his bag in his hand, he walked swiftly away, and passing through the principal streets, which were crowded with Moors, held steadily on without speaking to anyone, until he reached the outskirts of the town, and then struck off among the hedges and gardens. End of Chapter 14. Read by gracesilvey. Chapter 15a of Held Fast for England by Henty. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by gracesilvey. Held Fast for England by Henty. Chapter 15a. Bob's Mission. As soon as he found a secluded spot, he stripped off the clothes he wore and put on those of a Spanish sailor, and then, placing the others in the bag, buried it in the sandy soil, taking particular note of its position in regard to trees and surrounding objects, so as to be able to find it again. Then he turned to the right and skirted the town till he came down to the seashore again, and then strolled quietly back to the quays. In passing by the ships at anchor, he had noticed the names of the 4 Spaniards, and, after wandering about for a short time, he entered a wine shop and seated himself at a table near one at which 3 Spanish sailors sat drinking. From their talk, he learned that the British were shortly to be turned out of Tangiers, that the town was to be given up to the Spaniards, and that the British consul had, the day before, been taken to Salé, where the emperor now was. The English in the town had not yet been made prisoners, but it was believed that they would be seized and handed over to the Spaniards without delay. Having obtained this information, Bob saw that, at any rate for the present, he might, if he chose, appear in his own character, and regretted that he had buried his clothes before knowing how matters stood. However, there was no help for it but to go back again to the place where he had hidden them. This he did, and having put on his own clothes, he went straight to the consulate, which was a large house facing the port. A clerk was sitting in the office. "I understand Mr. Logie is away," Bob said. The clerk looked surprised, for he knew the whole of the small body of British residents well, and he could not understand how Bob could have arrived. "I am the bearer of letters to him from Governor Elliot," Bob said. "I came across by boat and landed 2 hours ago, but I was in disguise, not knowing how matters stood here, and have but now ascertained that, so far, the English are not prisoners." "Not at present," the clerk said. "But will you come into the house, sir? We may be disturbed here." "In the first place," Bob asked, when they were seated in an inner room, "when do you expect Mr. Logie back, and what is the real situation?" "My orders are, if I cannot see Mr. Logie himself, that I am to obtain as accurate a statement as possible as to how matters are going on here, as it is important that the governor should be able to inform vessels sailing from Gibraltar, east, whether they can or cannot put safely into the Moorish ports. Of course, we know that vessels have been several times taken by the Spaniards while at anchor close to the towns, but they might risk that, if there were no danger from the Moors themselves. But if the reports last sent by Mr. Logie are confirmed, the Moors would be openly at war with us, and would themselves seize and make prizes of vessels anchoring. The danger would, of course, be vastly greater than that of merely running the risk of capture, if a Spanish vessel of war happened to come into a port where they were at anchor. Of course, I am merely expressing the views of the governor. I am sorry to say, the clerk said, that there is no doubt the Moors are about to join the Spaniards in formal alliance against us. Englishmen are liable to insult as they go through the street. This, however, would not go for much by itself, but last week a number of soldiers rushed into the office, seized Mr. Logie, violently assaulted him, spat upon him, and otherwise insulted him, acting, as they said, by the express order of the Emperor himself. He is now practically a prisoner, having been taken under an escort to Salé, and at any moment the whole of the British colony here may be seized and thrown into prison. And if you know what Moorish prisons are, you would know that that would mean death to most of them, certainly, I should say, to all the ladies. But can they not leave in neutral vessels? No, the strictest orders have been issued against any Englishman leaving. They are, in fact, so far prisoners, although nominally at liberty to move about the town. I believe that the greater part of the Moors regret extremely the course their emperor has taken. Many have come in here, after dark, to assure Mr. Logie how deeply averse they were to this course, for that the sympathies of the population in general were naturally with the English in the struggle against the Spaniards who had, for all time, been the deadly foe of the Moors. Unfortunately, the emperor has supreme power, and anyone who ventured to murmur against his will would have his head stuck up over a gate in no time, so that the sympathy of the population does not count for much. How many English are there altogether? 104. We made up the list last week. Of course that includes men, women, and children. There are some 10 merchants, most of whom have 1 or 2 clerks. The rest of the men are small traders and shopkeepers. Some of them make their living by supplying ships that put in here with necessaries. A few, at ordinary times, trade with the rock and livestock. Half a dozen or so keep stores where they sell English goods to the natives. I have a mission to discharge to a Miss Cullum, or at least to a young lady living with her. Mrs. Cullum, I regret to say, died 3 weeks ago, the clerk said. Miss Harcourt, who is, I suppose, the young lady you mean, is now with Mrs. Cullum's servant, staying here. Mr. Logie had placed them in lodgings in the house of a Moorish trader just outside the town, but the young lady could not remain there alone after Mrs. Cullum's death. I will ring the bell and tell the servant to inform her that you are here. 2 minutes later, Bob was shown into a large sitting room on the first floor, with a veranda overlooking the sea. "Oh, Bob Repton, I am glad to see you," Amy Harcourt exclaimed, coming forward impulsively with both hands held out. "It is dreadfully lonely here. Mr. Logie's away, and poor Mrs. Cullum is dead. And as for Mrs. Williams, she does nothing but cry and say we are all going to be shut up and starved in a Moorish prison. But first, how are father and mother, and everyone at the Rock?" "They are all quite well, Amy, though your mother has been in a great state of anxiety about you, since she got your letter saying how ill Mrs. Cullum was. Here's a letter she has given me for you." He handed the girl the letter, and went out onto the veranda while she read it. "Mamma says I am to act upon Mr. Logie's advice, and that, if by any means he should not be in a position to advise me, I am to take your advice if Mrs. Cullum is dead. I don't think I am in a position to give you advice, Amy. What did Mr. Logie say about the state of affairs before he went away?" "He seemed to think things were going on very badly. You know, the soldiers rushed in here and assaulted him one day last week. They said they had orders from the Emperor to do so, and Mr. Logie said they certainly would not have dared to molest the British consul if it hadn't been by the Emperor's orders. He was talking to me about it the day before they took him away to Salé, and he said he would give anything if he could get me away to the Rock, for that the position here was very precarious, and that the Emperor might, at any moment, order all the English to be thrown into prison, and I know that the servants expect we shall all be killed by the populace. They have frightened Mrs. Williams nearly out of her senses. I never saw such a foolish woman. She does nothing but cry. She is the wife, you know, of Captain Cullum's soldier servant. Well, what do you advise, Bob?" I am sure I don't know what to advise, Amy. This seems a regular fix, doesn't it? But you are just as badly off as I am, she said. If they seize everyone else, of course they will seize you now you are here. Oh, I could get away easily enough, Bob said. I should dress myself up as a Spanish sailor. I have got the clothes here, and should boldly go on board one of the Spanish ships and take passage across to any port they are going to, and then manage to work round into Gibraltar again. But of course you can't do that. I couldn't go as a Spanish sailor, of course, the girl said, but I might dress up and go somehow. Anything would be better than waiting here, and then being thrown into one of their dreadful prisons. They say they are awful places. Do take me, Bob Repton. I do so want to get back to father and mother again, and I am quite well and strong now, as well as ever I was. Bob looked at the girl with a puzzled expression of face. He had promised her mother to do the best he could for her. The question was, what was the best thing? It certainly seemed that the position here was a very perilous one. If he left her here and harm befell her, what would her parents say to him? But on the other hand, how on earth was he to get her away? I tell you what, Amy, he said after a time. Who were the ladies Mrs. Colum saw most of? I suppose she knew some of the people here? Oh yes, she knew several, but she was most intimate with Mrs. Hamber. She is the wife of one of the principal merchants, and is very kind. She offered to take me in when Mrs. Colum died, but her husband lives out of the town, and Mr. Loki had promised Mrs. Colum that he would look after me until he could send me across. Besides, Mrs. Hamber's child is very ill with fever, and so he brought me here. Well, I will go and consult her, Bob said. I dare say the clerk downstairs will send a man with me to show me her house. Mrs. Hamber listened to Bob's account of his mission, asking a question now and again in a straightforward and decided way, which gave Bob an idea that she was a resolute sort of woman with plenty of common sense. Well, Mr. Repton, she said when he had finished, it is a difficult matter for anyone but the girl's mother to form an opinion upon. I remember hearing from Mrs. Colum about your going out and bringing in fruit when the scurvy was so bad, 2 months ago. She had received the news, no doubt, from her husband, and therefore it seems to me that you must be a very capable young gentleman with plenty of courage and coolness. The fact that Mrs. Harcourt gave you such a message as she did regarding her daughter shows that she has every confidence in you. If the girl were a year or two older, I should say it would be quite out of the question for her to attempt to make her way back to Gibraltar under your protection. But as she is still a mere child, and as you possess her mother's confidence, I don't see that this matters so much. If you are both taken prisoners, there is no reason for supposing that she would not be treated honorably by the Spaniards. They must have taken numbers of women in the vessels they have captured lately, and I suppose the girl would be placed with them. She would, at any rate, be far better off in a Spanish prison than in a Moorish one. Besides, I really consider that all our lives are in danger here. After the assault on Mr. Logie, it is just as likely the Emperor may order us all to be massacred as thrown into prison, or he might sell us as slaves, as they do at Algiers. There is no saying. I think that if I were in the position of the girl's mother at Gibraltar, I should say that it was better for her to run the risk of capture with you than to remain here, where there is no saying what may happen. She having every confidence in your honor, young gentleman. I thank you, Mrs. Hamber. I have no idea at present what plan I shall form. I may not see any possible way of getting out, but if I do, we will certainly attempt it. Major Harcourt belongs to the same regiment as my brother-in-law, and his wife and my sister are great friends, which is why I suppose she has confidence in me. I have known Amy now for a year and a half, and she is very often at my sister's. I will take care of her just the same as if she were a younger sister of my own. I don't see how I could go back and tell her mother that I left her here, with things in the state they are. I only hope they may not turn out so badly as you fear, and that, at the worst, the Moors will only hand you over as prisoners to the Spaniards. Bob went back to the consulate and told Amy the result of his conversation with Mrs. Hamber. I consider that has taken the responsibility off my shoulders, Amy. You referred me to Mrs. Hamber as the lady you knew best here. She is of opinion that, if she were your mother, she would advise your trying to get away with me. So now, we have only to decide how it is to be done. That is, if you still wish to try. Certainly I do, the girl said. Anything is better than waiting here, expecting the Moors to rush in as they did the other day and carry one off to prison, or kill one. Mr. Parrott, that is the gentleman you saw downstairs, said that you would stay here, and ordered a room to be prepared for you, and dinner is ready. I am sure you must be terribly hungry. Bob remembered now that he had had nothing to eat save some biscuits on board the boat and a piece of bread at the wine shop since he left Gibraltar, and that he really was desperately hungry. Amy had already had her dinner, but she sat by him, and they talked about their friends at the Rock. Now, he said, when he had finished, let us have a regular council of war. It was my intention to get a passage to Malaga, if I could, because I know something of the road back from there, but I could not do that with you. Why not, Bob? Because the voyage is too long. Someone would be certain to speak to you before you got across, and, as you can't talk Spanish, the cat would be out of the bag directly. If possible, we must manage to cross to Tarifa. It is only a few hours across to there, even if we go in an open boat, and now that the Spaniards are friends with the Moors, there ought to be no difficulty in getting a passage across there or to Algeciras. Of course, you can't go as you are, he said, looking at her rather ruefully. No, of course not, she said. I am not so silly as that. I should think I had better dress up like a boy, Bob. That would be a great deal the best plan, if you would not mind it, Bob said, greatly relieved that the suggestion came from her. It is the only thing that I can think of. There didn't seem any story one could invent to account for a Spanish girl being over here, but a ship's boy will be natural enough. If asked questions, of course, our story will be that we had been left behind here. There could be lots of reasons for that. Either we might have been on shore, and the vessel gone on without us, or you might have been sent ashore ill, and I might have been left to nurse you. That wouldn't be a bad story. What we must do when we get to the other side must depend upon where we land. I mean, whether we try to get straight in by boat, or to wait about until a chance comes. Once over there, you will have to pretend to be deaf and dumb, and then you can dress up as a Spanish girl, of course a peasant, which will be much more pleasant than going about as a boy, and better in lots of ways. So if I were you, I should take a bundle of things with me, so that we should have nothing to buy there. It is all very well buying disguises for myself, but I could never go into a shop to ask for all sorts of girls' clothes. Amy went off in a fit of laughter at the thought of Bob having to purchase feminine garments. It is all very well to laugh, Bob said. These are the sort of little things that are so difficult to work in. It is easy enough to make a general plan, but the difficulty is to get everything to fit in. I will have a talk with Mr. Parrott in the morning about the boats. He will know what boats have been trading with the Rock and what men to trust. You can talk to him now if you like, the girl said. He and Mr. Loki's other clerk have the top story of the house. Oh, then I will go up and see him at once. The sooner it is arranged, the better. If things are in the state that everyone says, you might all be seized and imprisoned any day. Bob went up at once to Mr. Parrott's rooms and had a long talk with him. The clerk quite agreed that anything would be better than for a young girl to be shut up in a Moorish prison, but he did not see how it was possible for them to find their way across to Gibraltar. Many of our fishermen are most courageous fellows, and have run great risk in taking letters from Mr. Loki across to Gibraltar. I do not suppose that the blockade is very much more strict than it was, and indeed, the fact that you got through shows that, with good luck, the thing is possible enough. But that is not the difficulty. The strictest order has been issued that no boat is to take Englishmen across to the Rock, or is to cross the straits on any pretense whatever, and that anyone evading this law will be executed, and his goods forfeited to the state. That is how it is Mr. Loki has been able to send no letters for the last month, and why none of the merchants here have tried to get across to the Rock. No bribe would be sufficient to tempt the boatmen. It would mean not only death to themselves if they ever returned, but the vengeance of the authorities would fall on their relations here. I'm afraid that there is nothing to be done that way at all. There are the 3 men who brought me across this morning, Bob said. They might be bribed to take us back. The governor authorized me to offer 100 pounds. I own that I don't like their looks. You would have some difficulty in finding them to begin with, Mr. Parrott said. and I don't think £100 would be likely to tempt them to run the risk." "I would not mind giving them 200 more," Bob said. "I have got that money of my own at Gibraltar, and I am sure if it were necessary, Major Harcourt would gladly pay us as much more to get his daughter back." 300 would be ample. If they would not run the risk for 100 apiece, nothing would tempt them. I should say your best plan would be to go down early tomorrow and see if you can find one of them. They are likely to be loitering about by the quays, as they have their boat there. The question is, are they to be trusted? They know that you have been sent out by the governor and that you are here on some special business, and they may very well think that the Spaniards will give a higher reward for you than you can give to be taken back. They will by this time know of the order against boats crossing and might betray you to the Moors. If you were going by yourself, of course, you could take all sorts of risks, but with this young lady under your protection, it would be different." "Yes, I see that, Mr. Parrott. Rather than run any risk, I should prefer being put ashore at any Spanish port by one of the ships in the harbor. If you give me the name of any Spanish merchantman who was here, say, a fortnight ago, my story that we were left behind owing to one of us being ill would be so simple that there need be no suspicion whatever excited. Tarifa or Algeciras would of course be the best places, as we should only be on board a few hours, and Miss Harcourt could very well pretend to be still ill and weak, and could lie down in a corner, and I could cover her up with a blanket till we get there. Once across, I don't so much mind. Even if we were detected, we should simply be 2 fugitives from here, trying to make our way to Gibraltar, and I don't think there would be any question of my being a spy. We should probably be sent to wherever they keep the English prisoners they have taken in ships, and there would be nothing very dreadful in that, even for her. We should probably be exchanged before long. There have been several batches sent in to the Rock in exchange for prisoners taken in prizes brought in by privateers." "Well, I really think that would be the best way, Mr. Repton. As you say, there will be nothing very dreadful in detention for a while with the Spaniards, while there is no saying what may happen here. If you like, I will send one of the consulate servants out, the first thing in the morning, to inquire what ports the Spanish craft are bound for, and when they are likely to sail. They seldom stop more than 2 or 3 days here. Most of them are taking livestock across for the use of the Spanish army, and, though Algeciras would be an awkward place for you to land at, because if detected there, you would be more likely to be treated as a spy. Still, in a busy place like that, no one would notice a couple of young sailors, and it would be no great distance for you to walk over to Tarifa, or any of the villages on the straits." "But how do you propose to get in from there? That is what seems to me the great difficulty." "Well, I got in before," Bob said, "and do not think that there ought to be much difficulty in getting hold of a boat. If I did, I should sail round the point and, keeping well outside the line of cruisers, come down on the coast the other side of Gibraltar, and so work along at night just as I did before. If I find it absolutely impossible to get a boat, of course I could not, with the girl with me, try to swim across from the head of the bay to the Rock, which is what I should have done had I been alone. So I should then go to the authorities and give myself up, and say that, being afraid that the Moors intend to massacre all the English at Tangiers, I had come across with this young lady, who is the daughter of an officer of the garrison, to put her into Spanish hands, knowing that there she would receive honorable treatment till she could be passed in at the next exchange of prisoners. I think that would be your very best course to pursue, unless you find everything turn out just as you would wish, Mr. Repton." When Bob came down in the morning, he at once went into the office below, and Mr. Parrott told him that one of the Spanish craft would start for Algeciras at noon. "Then I must ask you to send one of the servants out to buy some clothes such as are worn by a Spanish sailor boy, Mr. Parrott. I have my own suit upstairs, and will go off and arrange for a passage across directly after breakfast." "I will see to it," Mr. Parrott said. "The ship's decks will be crowded up with cattle. She is a small craft, and I hear she will take as many as can be packed on her deck. She is alongside now, taking them in. There is not much likelihood of any attention, whatever, being paid to you and your companion." Amy turned a little pale, and Bob told her that the attempt was to be made at once, but she said bravely, "I am glad there is to be no waiting. I do so long to be out of this town. I dare say I shall be a little nervous at first, but I shall try not to show it, and I shan't be really frightened, for I know that you will take care of me. End of Chapter 15a. Read by gracesilvey. Chapter 15b of Held Fast for England by G.A. Henty. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by gracesilvey. Held Fast for England by G.A. Henty. Chapter 15b. Bob's Mission Continued. As soon as breakfast was over, Bob changed his things and went down to the quay. He stopped at the vessel taking cattle on board. She was a polacca brig of about 150 tons. The captain was smoking a cigar aft, while the mate was seeing to the storing of the cattle. Bob went on board and told his story to the captain. I was left behind in charge of a cabin boy from the Esmeralda a fortnight ago. The boy had fever, and the captain thought it might be infectious, and put him ashore, but he soon got well. We want to be taken across, as our friends live not many miles from Tarifa. We will pay $1 apiece for our passage. The captain nodded. Be on board by noon. We shall not be a minute later. Bob went ashore and told Amy that everything was arranged without the slightest difficulty. He then went down to inspect the clothes. They will do very well, he said, except that they are a great deal cleaner than anything ever seen on a Spanish sailor. Those canvas trousers will never do as they are. He accordingly took some ashes and rubbed them well into the canvas, got some grease from the kitchen, and poured 2 or 3 large patches over the trousers. That is more like it, he said. The shirt will do well enough, but there must be a patch or 2 of grease upon the jacket and some smears of dirt of some kind. When he had done them to his satisfaction, he took them upstairs. What horrid, dirty-looking things! Amy exclaimed in disgust. They are clean enough inside, child. They are quite new, but I have been dirtying them outside to make them look natural. You must be dressed by 11:30, and you can tuck your hair up under that red nightcap, but you must manage to dirty your face, neck, and hands. You really ought to have some brown stain, but I don't suppose it is to be got. I will speak to Mr. Parrott. There is no stain that I know of, Mr. Parrott said, but I know Mr. Logie paints a little. I think you will find a box of colors upstairs. If you mix some Van Dyke brown in water and paint her with it, and let it dry on, I should think it would do very well, though of course it wouldn't stand washing. Bob found the paint box and soon mixed some paint. At 11:30, Amy came into the room, laughing a little shyly. That will do very well, Bob said encouragingly, except that you are a great deal too fair and clean. Look here, I have been mixing some paint. I think a wash of that will make all the difference. Now sit down while I color you. That will do capitally, he said when he finished. I think when it dries, it will be just about the right shade for a Spanish sailor boy. Have you got your bundle? That is right. Now here is my bag, and a couple of black Moorish blankets. I will bring Mr. Parrott up to say good-bye. Have you told your servant? No, I said nothing to her about it. She would make such a terrible fuss, there would be no getting away from her. We must ask Mr. Parrott to tell her after the vessel has set sail. Mr. Parrott pronounced the disguise excellent, and said that he should not have the slightest suspicion that she was anything but what she seemed to be. Amy felt very shy as she sallied out with Bob, but she gained courage as she saw that no one noticed her. When they arrived at the brig, the cattle were nearly all on board. Bob led the way across the gangway, and went up on to the forecastle. There he laid one of the blankets down against a stanchion, wrapped Amy in the other, so that her face was almost hidden, and told her to sit down and close her eyes, as if weak or asleep. Then he took up his post beside her. In a quarter of an hour the last bullock was on board. The gangway was at once hauled in, the hawsers thrown off, and the sails let drop, and, in another minute, the vessel was gliding away from the wharf. The wind was nearly due west, and the sheets were hauled in as she was headed across the straits. It was half an hour before the sailors' work was all done. Several of them came up onto the forecastle and began twisting cigarettes, and one at once entered into conversation with Bob. "Is the boy ill?" he said. "Yes, he has been ill, but is better now. It would have been better if he could have stopped a few days longer, but he was pining to get home. He won't have far to go when we get to Algeciras, and no doubt I shall be able to get him a lift in some cart that will be bringing provisions to the camp. The talk at once turned on the siege, the sailors expressing their certainty that the rock would soon be taken. Bob had moved away from Amy as if to allow her to sleep, undisturbed by the conversation. "There is a brig running down the straits at a good speed," one of the sailors said, when they were halfway across. "It is a nice breeze for her." Bob looked at the craft. She was about a mile away, and by the course they were steering, almost at right angles, would come very near to them. There was something familiar in her appearance, and he looked at her intently, examining every sail and shroud. Then doubt became certainty as his eye fell upon a small patch in one of the cloths of the top-gallant sail. It was the Antelope. One of the Spanish shot had passed through the top-gallant sail, and, as that was the only injury that sail had received, the bit had been cut out and a fresh one put in, before she sailed again from Gibraltar. She was flying Spanish colors. His heart beat fast. Would she overhaul them, or pass without taking notice of them, seeing that the Polaker was a small one, and not likely to be a valuable prize? The vessels approached each other quickly. The course the Antelope was taking would carry her some length or two behind the Spaniard. Bob hesitated whether to hail her as she came along. If his hail was not heard, he would of course be detected, and his plans entirely spoilt. And with the wind blowing straight across, and he in the bow, it would be by no means certain that his hail would be distinguished. Suddenly, to his delight, when the brig was within 100 yards of the Polaker, he saw her head come up, while the crew began to haul upon the sheets. An exclamation of surprise and alarm broke from the Spaniards as, in another minute, the Antelope was running parallel with them, a cable's length to windward. Then the port-holes were opened, and 8 guns run out. The Spanish flag was run down, and the British hoisted to the peak, and a summons to strike their flag shouted to the Spaniards. As the latter carried only 4 small guns, resistance was out of the question. The Spanish flag was lowered, and, in obedience to the gesticulations, rather than the words, of an officer on board the English brig, the halyards were thrown off, and the sails came down with a run. The Spanish sailors were frantic with rage, swearing by all the saints in the calendar. Bob had moved at once across to Amy. "Lie still, Amy. We are going to be captured by an English ship. It is the same privateer that I was in before. Don't make any sign until they come on board. In the fury that these Spaniards are in, they might stake their knives into us if they knew we were English." The brig had been thrown up into the wind as soon as the Polaker's sails had been lowered, and in 3 minutes a boat came alongside. Then Joe Lockett, followed by 6 sailors armed with pistols and cutlass, scrambled on board. "Now follow me, Amy," and descending the ladder, Bob made his way along the narrow gangway between the lines of cattle and then mounted to the poop. "Well, Joe, how are you?" The first mate of the Antelope started back in astonishment. "Why, Bob Repton," he exclaimed, "what on earth are you doing here, masquerading as a Spanish sailor?" "I am trying to get across to Gibraltar," he said. "Why, is this fellow bound for Gibraltar? In that case we have not got a prize as we fancied." "She's a fair prize, Joe. She's bound for Algeciras. I was going to make my way in from there as best I could." "That is all right, then. What has she got on board?" "Nothing beyond these cattle and some vegetables, I expect, but they are worth a lot of money on the rock." "Well, you will be able to tell us all about things, Bob. I will hail the captain to send Crofts on board with 12 men to take charge here, and then I will take you on board." "I have a friend here," Bob said, turning to Amy, who was standing timidly behind him, "so you must take him with me." "All right," Joe said carelessly. In 5 minutes, Bob stood again on the deck of the Antelope, and a hearty greeting was exchanged between him and Captain Lockett. "Before I tell you anything, Captain, which cabin am I to have?" "I will tell you why afterwards. I suppose it will be my old one?" "Yes, that is our one spare cabin, Bob. But I don't know why you are in such a hurry about it." "I will tell you presently," Bob laughed, and led the way below. "There, Amy," he said. "You can go in there and put on your own things again. I thought it would be more comfortable for you for them not to know it until you are properly dressed in your own clothes. You have brought a frock, of course." Yes, I thought I had better bring one in case we should be made prisoners. That is all right. When you are dressed, come upon deck. I will explain all about it before you appear. Bob, as briefly as possible, told his story to Captain Lockett and Joe, who were much amused to find that Bob's friend was a young lady. You are coming out in quite a new light, Bob, as a squire of dames, but I won't laugh at you. Now, I want to hear the last news. I overhauled that craft not so much to capture as to get the last news. There were reports before I started that the Moors were joining the Spaniards, and that their ports were closed to us, and what you say confirms that. That was one of the points I wanted to know, as I could not tell whether I could run in there safely were I chased. Now, as to getting into the Rock, are there cruisers active at present? Well, there are lots of them about. I think your best plan will be to run in close to the point, and hold on as if you were going into Algeciras, and that way they won't suspect you. Then, when you get right up the bay, haul across to the town. The wind is in your favor because you will have to tack to work up the bay, and if you make pretty long tacks they won't suspect you when you start across until you have got pretty well away, and with this breeze there will be no chance of their catching you before you are under our guns. That seems hopeful enough. At any rate, we will try it. I will send 6 more men on board the Polager. They will want to be handy with her sails. I will go myself and give Crofts orders. He had better keep ahead of us, for if we are chased by their gunboats, we can protect him. Just as sail was again caught up and the 2 vessels were under way, Amy Harcourt came on deck and was soon laughing and chatting merrily with the captain. At 4 in the afternoon they rounded the point, the Polager a few hundred yards ahead, and both flying Spanish colors. There were several Spanish cruisers and some gunboats outside them, but these paid no attention to their movements, and both beat up the bay, keeping close into the Spanish shore, but holding somewhat farther out at each tack. Now, Captain Lockett said, when they were within half a mile of Algeciras, we will run out this tack. There are 2 gunboats in our way, I see, but we must take our chances of them. Go and wave a handkerchief from the bow, Joe. Mr. Crofts will be on the lookout for the signal. The 2 vessels held away on the port tack. As the Polager approached the gunboats, a sudden bustle was observed on board them. They begin to smell a rat, Captain Lockett said. Hoist the topgallant sails, for the brig had been under easy sail, to enable her to hold her place with the Polager. The men were already at quarters, and the ports were open and the guns run out. Just as the gunboat nearest the Polager, finding the hail for her to bring to unheeded, fired a shot into her, the brig's head paid off, and she poured a broadside into the 2 gunboats. One of them was struck amidships. For a moment there was great confusion aboard, and then she made for her companion, evidently in a sinking condition. Several shots were now fired from the forts, but, though they fell near, the brig was uninjured. The second gunboat did not venture to attack so formidable an opponent, and half an hour later, the Antelope and her prize dropped anchor off the mole. Bob had already run down and put on his usual clothes, and he and Amy were at once rowed ashore and made their way to Major Harcourt's quarters. The delight of Amy's father and mother as she rushed into the room was extreme. Bob did not enter with her, but left her to tell her own story, and proceeded straight to the governor's, to whom he reported the state of affairs at Tangier. It is bad news, the governor said. However, I am extremely obliged to you for the valuable service that you have rendered, and, as I had the pleasure of before doing, when you brought in the oranges, I shall place your name in the orders of the day for having, as a volunteer, rendered signal service by carrying dispatches, at great risk, across to the Barbary coast. Bob then returned home. Captain Lockett had already been to the house and informed the O'Hanrahan's of his arrival. There you see, Carrie, Bob said, after his sister's first greetings were over. There was nothing to have been so terribly alarmed about. It isn't because you got through it safely, Bob, that there was no danger, his sister replied. It was a very foolish thing to do, and nothing will change my opinion as to that. Captain Lockett tells me you brought Amy Harcourt back with you, dressed up as a boy. I never heard of such a thing, Bob. The idea of a boy like you, not 18 yet, taking charge in that way of a young girl. Well, there was nothing else to do, Carrie, that I could see. I went to Mrs. Hamber, who was Mrs. Cullum's most intimate friend, and asked her opinion as to what I had better do, and she advised me to get Amy away, if I possibly could do so. I can't see what difference it makes, whether it is a boy or a girl. It seems to me that people are always so stupid about that sort of thing." Carrie laughed. "Well, never mind, Bob. Amy Harcourt is a very nice girl. A little too boyish, perhaps, but I suppose that is natural, being brought up in the regiment. I am very glad that you have brought her back again, and it will be an immense relief to her father and mother. Her mother has been here 3 or 4 times during these 2 days you have been away, and I am in no way surprised at her anxiety. They will be in here this evening, certainly, to thank you." "Very well, then I shall be round smoking a cigar with the doctor," Bob said. "I am very glad to have been of use to them, and to have got Amy back again. But I don't want to be thanked, and you tell them so. I hate being made a fuss about." And so, beyond a warm grasp of the hand on the part of Major Harcourt, and 2 or 3 words of hearty thanks on that of his wife the next time they met, Bob escaped any expression of gratitude. But the occurrence drew the 2 families together more closely, and Amy often came round with her father and mother in the evening, and there were many little confidential talks between Carrie and Mrs. Harcourt. It was some time before the anxiety as to the fate of the English inhabitants at Tangier was allayed. They were, at the beginning of December, forced to remove to Martine, a few miles from Tetuan, abandoning their houses and all their property, which was estimated at the value of £60,000, and 3 days afterwards were handed over as prisoners to the Spaniards. They were then put on board a ship and taken to Algeciras, where they were kept for nearly a month, prisoners on board ship, but were, on the 11th of January, 1781, sent across to Gibraltar. The next 5 months passed slowly and heavily. Occasionally privateers and other craft ran through the blockade of the Spanish cruisers, and succeeded in getting into port. Some of these brought wine and sugar, of both of which the garrison were extremely short, and occasionally a few head of cattle and other provisions. All of these were sold by public auction, the governor considering that to be the fairest way of disposing of them. On the 12th of April, another great convoy under Admiral Darby entered the port. It consisted of about 100 merchantmen under the protection of a powerful fleet. The joy of the garrison and inhabitants was intense, although, among the latter, this was mingled with a certain feeling of uneasiness. Deserters had at various times brought in reports that, should Gibraltar be again relieved, it was the purpose of the Spaniards to bombard the town. Hopes were entertained that so wanton an act of cruelty would not be carried out, for the entire destruction of the town would not advance in the smallest degree the progress of the siege. At 11:15, just as the van of the convoy came to an anchor off the New Mole, Fort San Philip opened fire upon the town, and, at the signal, the whole of the batteries in the forts and lines followed suit. 114 guns and mortars rained their shot and shell upon the town, and the guns of the batteries of the garrison at once responded. Several of the officers of the 58th and their wives had come up to Captain O'Hallahan's to enjoy from the terrace the view of the great convoy entering the port. All were in the highest spirits at the thought of the abundant supplies that would now be at their disposal, and in the belief that the Spaniards, seeing that the garrison was again amply provisioned, would abandon the siege, which had now lasted for 22 months. Suddenly there came upon the air the deep sound of the guns of San Philip, followed by a prolonged roar as the whole of the Spanish batteries opened fire. The hum of shot could be heard, followed by the explosion of shells, the fall of masonry, and screams and cries. "The bombardment has begun at last," Captain O'Hallahan exclaimed. The greatest consternation reigned among the ladies. Several of them had left children in their quarters, and, although the barracks were so placed as to be, to a great extent, sheltered from the enemy's fire from the land side, they were still terribly anxious as to their safety. 2 of them had, like the O'Hallahans, quarters in the town itself, and the husbands of these ladies, accompanied by Captain O'Hallahan and Bob, at once set out to bring the children up to the house, which was perfectly sheltered. The scene in the town was a pitiful one. Men, women, and children were flying in the wildest alarm towards the gate looking south, and thence out to the huts that the more prudent ones had erected many months before near Europa Point. Shot and shell were raining down, while chimneys and portions of masonry fell clattering in the streets. Sick people were being carried out on doors or planks, and most of the inhabitants were laden with what few articles of value they could snatch up at the first alarm. The children were soon brought up to the O'Hanrahan's, and then, for a time, there was nothing to do but to listen to the roar of artillery. The officers and Bob ascended the rock to a point near one of the batteries, whence they could command a view of the Spanish lines. The flashes of smoke were bursting forth almost incessantly, but were answered shot for shot from the English batteries, which had already almost silenced the San Carlos battery, which mounted a large number of mortars, and against which the fire of the English guns was concentrated. Between 1 and 2 o'clock the Spanish fire abated and soon ceased altogether. The inhabitants took advantage of the lull to hurry back to their houses, whence they removed the lighter and more portable articles, but the heavy stores, of which it now appeared many of them had large quantities concealed, they were, of course, unable to take away. The discovery of these stores excited much indignation among the troops. The inhabitants had been constantly representing themselves as reduced to the last point of hunger, and had frequently received provisions from the scanty supplies of the garrison, and the soldiers were exasperated on finding that, all this time, they possessed great stores of wine, flour, and other articles, which they were hoarding to produce and sell when prices should rise to even more exorbitant heights than they had already reached. At 5 o'clock, the enemy's batteries opened again, and the firing continued without intermission all that night. As several casualties had taken place in the barracks and quarters, marquees were, on the following morning, served out to all the officers whose quarters were exposed to fire, and these were pitched near Europa Point, as were also a large number of tents for the use of the inhabitants. A considerable body of troops were kept under arms near the northern gate, in case the Spaniards should attempt to make an assault under cover of their fire, and 500 officers and men were told off to assist in the work of getting the supplies up from the wharves, as fast as they were landed from the transports. The bombardment continued during the whole of the next 2 days. The mortars still poured their shells upon the town, but the guns were now directed at our batteries, and their fire was remarkably accurate. On the 14th, the unloading parties were increased to 1,000 men, and strong detachments of troops were told off to extinguish the fires in the town, as the enemy were now discharging shell filled with a composition that burned with great fury, igniting everything with which it came in contact. The troops engaged upon this duty were not long in broaching the casks of wine found in such abundance in many of the ruined houses. For 2 reasons they had been living almost entirely on salt provisions, and wine had been selling at prices vastly beyond their means. It was scarcely surprising, then, that they should take advantage of this opportunity. The stores were practically lost, for the whole town was crumbling to pieces beneath the fire of the enemy's mortars, and was on fire in several places, and little if any of the liquor and stores consumed could, in any case, have been saved. However, for a time insubordination reigned. The troops carried off liquor to their quarters, barricaded themselves there, and got drunk, and it was 2 or 3 days before discipline was restored. Up to this time, the conduct of the soldiers had been most exemplary, and they had borne their prolonged hardships without a murmur, and this outbreak was due as much to a spirit of revenge against the inhabitants for hiding away great stores of provisions and liquor, with a view to making exorbitant profits, as from a desire to indulge in a luxury of which they had been so long deprived. On the 15th, the enemy's fire was hotter than ever, and the guns were withdrawn from our batteries, as they produced but little effect upon the Spanish batteries, and the men working them suffered a good deal from the besiegers' fire. 2 officers were dangerously wounded in one of the casemates of the king's bastion, and the fire was so heavy around some of the barracks that all the troops who could not be disposed of, and the casemates and bomb-proofs, were sent out of the town and encamped southward. And the next day, all the women and children who had gone with their husbands and fathers into the casemates were also removed and placed under canvas. All this gave incessant work to the troops, for there was no level ground upon which the tents could be pitched, and as it was therefore necessary to level all the ground into terraces, it was some days before the camps were arranged in anything like order. Each day the enemy sent out their gunboats to harass the merchantmen, but these were always driven back by the guns of the fleet. On the 17th, the besiegers' shells set fire to the Spanish church, which had been used as a storehouse. Strong parties were sent down to remove the provisions, which consisted largely of barrels of flour. These were carried up and piled so as to afford protection to the casemates, which had been frequently entered by the enemy's shots, several men having been killed there. They proved a valuable defense and afforded, moreover, great amusement to the soldiers who, whenever a barrel was smashed by a shell, carried off the contents and quickly converted them into pancakes, until so many casks had been emptied that the whole structure came toppling down. On the 18th, a shell came through the arch of one of the casemates, killing 2 and wounding 4 men, and in consequence a good many more of the troops were sent under canvas. On the 20th, the work of unloading the great portion of the transports was completed, and the admiral, who was most anxious to take advantage of the easterly wind that was blowing to sail out of the straits, gave the signal for departure. Many of the merchantmen whose cargoes were consigned to merchants and traders on the Rock carried them back to England, as the merchants, having no place whatever in which to store goods, for the town was now almost entirely destroyed, refused to accept them. The transports with ordnance stores were brought in behind the new mole to be discharged at leisure, while several colliers were run close in and scuttled so that their cargoes could be removed as required. A great many of the inhabitants and of the officers' wives and families embarked on board the fleet before it left. The enemy's fire still continued very heavy, and their guns and mortar boats on the 23rd came boldly out and opened fire upon the working parties, who were stacking the barrels and stores at the south end of the Rock. The wife of the soldier was killed, and several men wounded. On the 26th, the governor determined sternly to repress the drunkenness that still prevailed, owing to the soldiers going down among the ruins of the town, where they occasionally discovered uninjured casks of wine. An order was therefore issued on that day that any soldier convicted of being drunk, asleep at his post, or marauding should be immediately shot. On the 27th, a convoy of 20 ships, in charge of the Brilliant and 3 other frigates, came in from Minorca, where the governor had ordered provisions to be purchased in case the convoy expected from England did not arrive. The arrival of these ships largely added to the stores at the disposal of the garrison. End of Chapter 15b, read by gracesilvey. Chapter 16 of Held Fast for England by G.A. Henty. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by gracesilvey. Held Fast for England by G.A. Henty. Chapter 16. A Cruise in the Brilliant. While the bombardment continued, Bob had been constantly occupied. He had, some time before, put down his name as a volunteer for service if required, and he and several others, who had similarly enrolled themselves, had been appointed to assist in looking after the removal of the soldiers' wives and children to the tents erected for them, and to see to their comfort there. He had also been in charge of bodies of laborers employed by the governor in the work of leveling the ground and transporting stores. Captain O'Halloran was constantly away on duty, and soon after the bombardment began, it was found necessary to drive the whole of the poultry into the lower part of the house, the Spaniards retaining only one room for their own accommodation. Had not this step been taken, the chickens would speedily have been stolen by marauders as, in the absence of Captain O'Halloran and Bob, there was no one to protect them. After the issue of the governor's proclamation, discipline was speedily restored, and there was no longer any occasion to keep them under shelter. The bombardment was followed by heavy rains, which caused very great discomfort to the troops. The water, pouring in torrents down the face of the hills, swept away the newly raised banks and brought down the tents, the soldiers having to turn out in the wet, and as the troops, owing to their heavy duties, were only 1 night out of 3 in bed, the discomfort and annoyance were very great. Great quantities of the provisions, too, were damaged, as these were all stacked in the open air, with no other covering than that afforded by the sails of the colliers, which were cut off and used for the purpose. Until the end of the month the downfall of rain was incessant, and was accompanied with heavy storms of thunder and lightning. The batteries required constant repair, and the labors of the troops were very severe. Since the departure of Admiral Darby's fleet, the enemy appeared to have given up all hopes of compelling the place to surrender by hunger. The convoy from Minorca had not been interfered with, and on the 2nd of May 2 native craft came in from Algiers with sheep, wine, and brandy, unmolested by the enemy's cruisers. The enemy's fire had never entirely ceased since the commencement of the bombardment, and now amounted to about 1,500 rounds every 24 hours, the gunboats generally coming out every day and sending their missiles into the town and batteries, the latter being especially the mark of the enemy's land guns, which reached even the highest batteries on the rock. All through May and June the enemy's fire continued, dropping towards the end of the latter month to about 500 shot and shell a day. The gunboats were especially annoying, directing their fire against the south end of the rock, and causing great alarm and distress among the fugitives from the town encamped there. Occasionally they directed their fire towards the houses that had escaped the fire of the land batteries, and several shot and shell fell near the O'Halloran's, but, fortunately, without hitting the house. The volunteers had now been released from duty, and Bob was free to wander about as he pleased. As, since his exploit in fetching the fruit, he had become known to every officer in the garrison, he was a privileged person, and was able to enter any of the batteries, and to watch the effects of their fire against the enemy's forts and lines. He often spent the day on board the Brilliant. At the end of June the frigate went away for a fortnight's cruise, and the captain invited Bob to accompany them. "We shall all expect great things from you, Mr. Repton, as you managed to capture some 50,000 pounds worth of prizes when you were on board that privateer brig. You ought to put the frigate into the way of taking at least 4 times as much." "It is easy to turn a brig into anything, Captain Langton, but there is no making one of His Majesty's frigates look other but what she is. The mere sight of your topsails is enough to send every Spanish craft into port." For 3 or 4 days the frigate sailed along the coast, keeping well out during the day, and closing with the land in the evening. 2 or 3 small coasters were picked up by the boats, but they were scarcely worth sending into Gibraltar. On the 5th day a large barquette was seen, making in from the south. All sail was made, but the barquette had the weather gauged, and, crossing her, ran into the shore and anchored under the shelter of a battery. "That would be a prize worth having, Bob," Gieseke said. "I wonder what she has got on board. Perhaps she is like that craft you captured, chock full of lead and silver, from Lima." "I think I can tell you what she is full of," Bob, who had been examining her through a glass he had borrowed from the 3rd lieutenant, replied. "How do you mean you could tell, Bob? She has not got her bill of lading stuck upon her broadside, I suppose?" "She has not, Jim, but I can tell you without that." "Well, what has she got on board?" "She has got a very strong crew, Jim, and 24 guns. "Why, how on earth did you know that, Bob?" he asked, staring at his friend in surprise. "Because, Jim, I have been on board and counted the guns. That is the craft I swam off to nearly 2 years ago. You hunted for her then, you know, but I suppose she had gone into one of the ports. But that is her, I can almost swear." "I don't know whether there is a better glass than this on board, but if there is, I should be glad to have a look through it. Yet I feel certain without that. Her stern is of a rather peculiar shape, and that stern gallery looks as if it was pinched out of her, instead of being added on. We particularly noticed that when we were sailing with her. I can't be mistaken about it." "I think the captain ought to know then," Jim said. "I will speak to Mr. Rawdon. He is in charge of the watch." Jim went up on to the quarter-deck, touched his hat, and informed the 2nd lieutenant what Bob had told him. Mr. Rawdon went up at once to the captain, who was talking to the 1st lieutenant, and examining the barquette and battery through his glass. Mr. Sankey has reported to me, sir, that Mr. Repton is very strongly of opinion that the barquette there is a Spanish ship of war he boarded by night, just after the beginning of hostilities. He told us about it, sir, and we spent 2 or 3 days in looking for her." "Of course I remember," the captain said. "Have the kindness to pass the word for Mr. Repton to come aft." Bob soon stood before the captain. "Mr. Rawdon tells me that you are of opinion that the barquette in there is the disguised Spanish sloop you boarded 2 years ago." "Yes, sir, I am almost sure of it, but I should like to have another look at her through your glass before I speak with certainty." The captain handed his glass, which was a remarkably good one, to Bob. "That is her," Bob said, after a minute's examination. "I could swear to her anywhere," and he then pointed out to the captain the peculiarities he had noticed. "I can make her figurehead too," he said. "It is a saint, though I don't know what saint, but if you notice, sir, you will see that, instead of standing nearly upright, he leans much more forward than usual. I remember the captain saying he looked as if he was going to take a header. So with that and the stern gallery, there is no possibility of mistaking her." The captain again examined the barquette through his glass. "Yes, I noticed both the points you mention. Well, I am much obliged to you for the news. It is very important. I was thinking of cutting her out tonight, and should have fallen into the same error you so nearly did in the privateer." Bob bowed and retired. "We should have caught a Tartar, Mr. Lyons, if we had sent the force we were talking about to cut her out, but I think we must have her somehow." "I hope so, sir. We have had a very dull time of it, with nothing to do but to exchange shots occasionally with those gunboats, and to get under sail now and then to escort some craft or other into port. The Navy hasn't done much to boast of during this siege, and it has been very hard on us being cooped up there in Gibraltar, while the fleet all over the world are picking up prizes and fighting the French and Spanish. Why, we haven't made enough prize money in the last 2 years to pay for pipe clay and powder." "Yes, we all feel that, Mr. Lyons. We have certainly been terribly out of luck. That privateer Miss Repton was on board did more in her week's cruise than all His Majesty's ships in Gibraltar have done in the last 2 years. We must take the craft inshore if we can. There is no doubt she is ably commanded, for she is so well disguised that we never suspected her for a moment. Therefore, there is not the least chance of our catching her napping. She is a formidable craft to cut out with the boats, even if she hadn't the aid of the battery." "There is no doubt about that, sir. I think Mr. Repton reported before that she carried 24 guns, and all heavy metal. As far as I can make out with the glass, the battery mounts 12 guns. Yes, that is the number. Besides, you see, we dare not take the frigate in nearer than a mile, and a mile and a quarter would be safer, so that we could not be of any assistance beyond annoying the battery with long shot. It seems to me that there is only one chance." "What is that, sir?" "We must land a strong party some distance along the shore, and make an attack upon the battery, and carry it by surprise. I can make out some huts behind it. I suppose they wouldn't have less than 100 soldiers there, perhaps 150. If we can drive them off and capture the battery, we can open fire down upon the ship. At that distance we could fairly sweep her deck with grape. The rest of our boats would be lying ahead and astern of her, and as soon as the battery opened, they could make a dash for her. The crew of the barquette would be so disorganized by the fire of the battery that they should hardly be able to make very much of a fight of it." "That seems like a capital plan, sir. The only question is the number of hands. Suppose you send 80 to take the battery, we should only have as many more to spare for the boat attack on the ship, and that would leave us with only 100 on board. I should think she would carry a fighting crew of 200 at least. These Spaniards are always very strongly manned." "I should think that would be about it. They are long odds, but not too long, I think, Mr. Lyons. At any rate, we will try. Lay her off the land, Mr. Lyons, then we will go into my cabin and make all the arrangements." There was much talk and excitement among the crew, for the general opinion was that the captain would try to cut out the craft lying under the Spanish battery. The Navy had for a long time been very sore at their inactivity, and had fretted that no attempts had been made to cut out the Spanish vessels across the bay. The admiral had steadily set his face against all such attempts, considering that the benefits to be gained did not justify the risks, for had any of his small squadron been damaged or sunk by the guns of the batteries, The consequences would have been very serious, as the Spanish gunboats would then have been able to carry on their operations without check, and it would have been next to impossible for vessels to run the blockade. The information Bob had given was soon known to all the officers, and was not long before it permeated through the crew, and added to their anxiety to cut the Spaniard out, for although the prize money would be less than if she had been a richly laden merchantman, the honor and glory was proportionately greater. The undertaking would be a serious one, but the prospect of danger is never deterrent to a British sailor. There was great satisfaction when, presently, it became known that the crews of the whole of the boats were to muster. Arms were inspected, cutlasses ground, and everything prepared. It was early in the morning when the Spanish barquette had been first discovered, and 10 o'clock when the frigate had sailed away from land, as if considering the Spanish craft too strongly protected to be attacked. When 5 miles away from land, her course was laid east, and, under easy sail, she maintained the same distance on the coast. The plan of operations was that the first lieutenant, with 30 marines and as many sailors, should land at a spot some 2 miles from the battery, and should make their way inland, and come down upon the position from the rear. 100 men and the rest of the boats should make for the barquette direct. This party was to act in 2 divisions, under the 2nd and 3rd lieutenants, respectively, and were to lie one to the east and the other to the west of the barquette, and remain there until the guns of the battery opened upon her. Then they were to row for her at all speed, a blue light being burned by each division when they were within 100 yards of the enemy, as a warning to their friends in the battery, who were then to fire round shot instead of grape. The frigate was to venture in as closely as she dared, anchor broadside on, and open fire at the enemy. Gieseke was told off to the landing party, and Bob went up to the captain and requested leave to accompany him, as a volunteer. "You see, sir," he said, "we may fall in with peasants, or be challenged by sentries as we approach the battery, and my ability to speak Spanish might be an advantage." "It would, undoubtedly," the captain said. "Well, Miss Repton, I shall be very glad to accept your services." At 4 in the afternoon, the frigate's head was again turned west, and, at 10 o'clock, the boats for the landing party were lowered, and, the men taking their places in them, rowed away for the shore, which was some 2 miles distant. The night was dark, but Mr. Lyons had with him a pocket compass, and had, before embarking, taken the exact bearings of the battery from the spot where they would land. He was therefore able to shape his course to a point half a mile in its rear. The strictest silence had been enjoined, and the little body of sailors made their way inland until they came upon a road running parallel with the shore. They followed this for about half a mile, and then struck off inland again. The country was highly cultivated, with orchards, vineyards, and orange groves. Their progress was slow, for they had many times to cut a passage through the hedges of prickly pear. At last they reached a spot where they believed themselves to be directly behind the battery. Here there was a path, leading in the direction which they wished to follow. In a quarter of an hour, they made out some lights ahead of them, and the lieutenant halted his men, and again repeated the orders they had before received. "You are to go straight at the huts. As you approach them, you are to break up into parties of 10, as already formed. Each party is to attack one hut, cut down all who resist, seize and carry away all arms. Never mind the men. If you have once got their arms, they cannot trouble us afterwards. Waste no time, but, directly you have got all the firelocks in one hut, make for another. As soon as all have been cleared out, make for the battery. Now, let the officers told off to command parties each fall in, at the head of his 10 men. Mr. Repton, you will keep beside me to answer a challenge." They were within 50 yards of the huts when a sentinel challenged, "Who goes there?" "Soldiers of the king," Bob answered in Spanish, "with reinforcements for you." "Halt till I call an officer," the sentry said. But the lieutenant gave the word, and the whole party dashed forward at a run. The sentry hesitated in surprise for a moment, and then discharged his piece. The sailors gave a cheer, and rushed at the huts. Taken utterly by surprise, the Spaniards at first offered no resistance whatever as the sailors rushed in. Indeed, few of them attempted to get out of bed. The blue lights, with which one man in each party was provided, were lighted as they entered, and the arms were collected without a moment's delay, and they were off again before the Spaniards were fairly awake to what had happened. There were 10 huts, each containing 20 men. 2 or 3 shots were fired as they entered the last 2 huts, but the Spaniards were overpowered in an instant, as they were here vastly outnumbered. The officers were made prisoners, and 10 men being placed over them, the rest of the force, now carrying 3 muskets each, ran down into the battery. The sentries here threw down their arms at once and were allowed to go where they pleased. "Pile the arms you have captured," Lieutenant Lyons ordered. "Run the ramrods down them, and see if they are loaded. The Spaniards are not likely to rally, but if they do, we can give them a hot reception. Now, gunner, break open the magazine, there, and load with grape." By this time the drum was beating to arms in the vessel below, the shots fired having given the alarm, and lights were seen to flash along the deck. In 2 minutes the guns were loaded, and these opened with a fire of grape upon the deck of the vessel, which was near enough to be distinctly seen by the glare of the blue lights. As the first gun was fired, an answering flash came from sea, as the frigate also opened fire. For 5 minutes the guns were worked fast. Then 2 lights burst out in close succession, ahead and astern of the barquette. "Cease firing grape! Load with round shot!" the lieutenant shouted, but a moment later a loud cheer broke from the sailors as, by the lights in the boats, the Spanish ensign was seen to run up to the peak of the barquette, and then at once to fall again to the deck. The barquette had surrendered. "Now, gunners, spike the guns," the lieutenant ordered, "and then tumble them off the carriages." This was soon done. "Now, let each man take one of the muskets, and throw the rest of them over the parapet down the rocks." "That is right. Now, fall in." The sailors fell in and marched back to the huts. The Spanish officers were placed in the midst, and 20 men were told off to fire the huts. This was soon done. The lieutenant waited until they were well alight, and then gave the order to march. They took the coast road this time for 2 miles, and then struck off to the shore and saw, a few hundred yards away, the lantern that had been hoisted on one of the boats as a signal. They were challenged by the boatkeeper, who had moored the boats 20 yards from the shore. A cheer broke out as the answer was given. The grapnels were pulled up, and the boats were soon alongside. The party embarking rowed out in the direction where they knew the frigate to be, and, as soon as they were fairly out from the shore, they saw the 3 lights she had hoisted as a signal. In half an hour they were alongside. "I need not ask if you succeeded, Mr. Lyons," the captain said as the boats came up, "for I have seen that. You have not had many casualties, I hope?" "Only one, sir. One of the marines has a ball in his shoulder. There were only 5 or 6 shots fired in all, and no one else has as much as a scratch." "I am truly glad to hear it," the captain said. "It has been a most successful surprise. I don't think the boats can have suffered either." "I don't think there was a shot fired at them, sir," the lieutenant said. "The Spaniard ran up his colors and dropped them again directly the boats showed their lights. I fancy they must have suffered very heavily from our fire. You see, they were almost under our guns, and we must have pretty well torn up their decks." "We shall soon hear," the captain said. "The boats are towing the Spaniard out. She will be alongside in a few minutes." The wind had entirely dropped now, and in a short time the Spaniard was brought close alongside the frigate, and Mr. Repton came on board to report. "The ship is the San Joaquin, mounting 24 guns, with a crew of 220 men, sir. Her casualties are very heavy. The men had just poured up on deck, it seems, when the battery opened fire. The captain, first lieutenant, and 56 men are killed, and there are 43 wounded. We have no casualties. Their flag came down just as we got alongside." "Then, as far as we are concerned," the captain said, "this is one of the most bloodless victories on record. There will be no death promotions this time, gentlemen, but I am sure you won't mind that. It has been a most admirably managed affair altogether, and I am sure that it will be appreciated by my lords of the Admiralty. You will take command of her at present, Mr. Lyons, with the crew now on board. Dr. Colfax and his assistant will go off with you to attend to the wounded, and will remain on board until we get into Gibraltar. Mr. Repton, you will be acting first, and I can only say that I hope you will be confirmed." The frigate and her prize at once sailed for Gibraltar. On their arrival there, the captain took some pains, by sending up larger yards, and by repainting the broad white streaks showing the portholes, to restore the prize to its proper appearance as a ship of war. We should not get half so much credit for a capture if you took her into Portsmouth looking like a lubberly merchantman, the captain said to Mr. Lyons. I don't care about patching up all those shot holes in the bulwarks. That gives her the appearance of having been taken after a sharp action, and the deck looks almost like a ploughed field. I shall give you 50 men, Mr. Lyons. I can't spare more than that. That will do, sir. Nothing smaller than ourselves is likely to interfere with us, and, if a large frigate engaged us, we should not have more chance with 100 men on board than with 50. In that case, we shall have to trust to our legs. Of course, if we fall in with 2 or 3 of the enemy's ships, I should run up the Spanish flag. I will find out if I can from the prisoners what is her private number. If I hoist that in the Spanish flag, it ought to deceive them. I will get her back to England, if possible, sir. You will, of course, take home my report, Mr. Lyons. It is sure to give you your step, I think. Next day, the San Joaquin sailed, and 6 weeks later, a sloop of war brought dispatches to the admiral. Among them was a letter from the Admiralty to Captain Langton, expressing their gratification at the very able arrangements by which he had captured and silenced a Spanish battery, and cut out the sloop of war, San Joaquin, anchored under its guns without any loss of life. It was, they said, a feat almost without parallel. They stated that they had, in accordance with his recommendation, promoted Mr. Lyons to the rank of commander, and they confirmed Mr. Repton in rank of first lieutenant, the third lieutenant becoming second, and the senior passed midshipman, Mr. Outram, being promoted to that of third lieutenant. No change of any importance had taken place at Gibraltar during the absence of the Brilliant, except that the governor had determined to retaliate for the nightly annoyance of the gunboats, and accordingly 6 guns were fired at a very considerable elevation behind the old mole, and shells fired from them. These reached the enemy's camp and caused, as could be seen from the heights, great alarm and confusion. It was determined that in future, when the enemy's gunboats bombarded our camps and huts, we should retaliate by throwing shells into their camp. The day after the Brilliant returned, the Helena, sloop of war with 14 small guns, was seen working in towards the rock. The wind, however, was so light that she scarcely moved through the water. 14 Spanish gunboats came out to cut her off. For a time she maintained a gallant contest against odds that seemed overwhelming, although the garrison gave her up as lost. But when the wind suddenly freshened, she sailed through her opponents into the port, where she was received with ringing cheers by the soldiers lining the batteries. Week after week passed in minor hostilities. There was a constant exchange of fire between our batteries and those of the enemy. The gunboats continued their operations, and we, in return, shelled their camp. Fresh works were erected on both sides. Casualties took place almost daily, but both troops and inhabitants were now so accustomed to the continual firing that they went about their ordinary avocations, without paying any attention to the shot and shell, unless one of the latter fell close at hand. November came and, in spite of the heavy fire maintained by our batteries, the enemy's works continually advanced towards the rock, and when, in the middle of the month, it was seen that the new batteries were being armed and placed in readiness to open fire, the governor determined to take the offensive. Accordingly, after gunfire on the evening of the 26th, an order was issued for all the grenadier and light infantry companies, with the 12th and Hardenberg's regiment, to assemble at 12 o'clock at night, with a party of engineers and 200 workmen from the line regiments, for a sortie upon the enemy's batteries. The 39th and 59th regiments were to parade at the same hour, to act as support to the attacking party. 100 sailors from the ships of war were to accompany them. The attacking party numbered 1,014 rank and file, besides officers and non-commissioned officers. This was exclusive of the 2 regiments forming the supports. The attacking force was divided into 3 columns. At 2:45 in the morning, the column moved out. The enemy's pickets discovered the advance as soon as it passed the outlying work known as Forbes Barrier, and after firing fell back. Lieutenant Colonel Hugo's column, which was in front, pushed on rapidly, and entered the enemy's lines without opposition, when the pioneers began to dismantle the work. Hardenberg's regiment and the central column attacked and carried the tremendous work known as the San Carlos Battery. The enemy were unable to withstand for a moment the fierce attack of the troops, and in a very short time the whole of the advanced works were in our hands. The leading corps formed up to resist any attempt the enemy might make to repel the sortie, and the working parties began to destroy the enemy's work. Faggots dipped in tar were laid against the fascines and gabions, and in a short time columns of fire and smoke rose from all parts of the works occupied. In an hour the object of the sortie was effected. Trains were laid to the magazines, and the troops fell back. Just as they reached the town, the principal magazine blew up with a tremendous explosion. The enemy appeared to have been wholly confounded at this sudden attack upon their advanced works, the fugitives from which created a panic throughout the whole army, and although the main Spanish lines, mounting 135 heavy pieces of artillery, were but a few hundred yards behind the works attacked, not a single shot was fired at the troops engaged. The batteries continued burning for 3 days, and, when they ceased to smoke, nothing but heaps of sand remained of the works that had cost the enemy months of labor to erect. It was some days before the Spaniards appeared to come to any definite conclusion as to their next step. Then large numbers of men set to work to re-establish their batteries, and things fell into their old routine again. Every day shots were exchanged occasionally. Vessels made their way in and out, being sometimes briskly chased by the enemy's gunboats, sometimes passing in with little interference, for by this time the Spaniards must have recognized that there was no hope whatever of reducing Gibraltar by blockade. There was a great deal of sickness in the garrison, but comparatively little of this was due to scurvy, for every available corner of ground was now cultivated, and the supply of vegetables, if not absolutely sufficient to counteract the effects of so long and monotonous a diet of salt meat, was yet ample to prevent any serious outbreak of scurvy recurring. In February, fresh activity was manifested among the besiegers. Vast numbers of mules were seen, bringing fascines to their work. At the end of March, the Fernan store ship arrived, and a few hours later, 4 transports with the 97th Regiment, under the convoy of 2 frigates, came in. A singular series of casualties was caused by a single shot, which entered an embrasure in Willis Battery, took both legs off 2 men, 1 leg off another, and wounded another man in both legs. Thus 4 men had 7 legs taken off or wounded by 1 shot. These casualties were caused by the inattention of the men to the warning of a boy who was looking out for shot. There were 2 boys in the garrison whose eyesight was so keen that they could see the enemy's shot coming, and both were employed in the batteries especially exposed to the enemy's fire, to warn the men to withdraw themselves into shelter when shot were coming. This quickness of eyesight was altogether exceptional. Standing behind a gun, and knowing therefore the exact course the shot will take, it is comparatively easy for a quick-sighted man to follow it, but there are few indeed who can see a shot coming towards them. In this respect, the ear is a far better index than the eye. A person possessed of a fair amount of nerve can judge, to within a few yards, the line that a shot coming towards him will take. When first heard, the sound is as a faint murmur, increasing as it approaches, to a sound resembling the blowing off of steam by an express engine as it rushes through a station. At first, the keenest ear could not tell the direction in which the shot is traveling, but, as it approaches, the difference in the angle becomes perceptible to the ear, and a calm listener will distinguish whether it will pass within 20 or 30 yards to the right or left. It would require an extraordinary acute ear to determine more closely than this, the angle of flight being so very small, until the shot approaches almost within striking distance. The garrison had been trying experiments with carcasses and red-hot shot. A carcass is a hollow shot or shell pierced with holes, but instead of being charged with powder, to explode it either by means of a fuse or by percussion, it is filled with a fierce burning composition so that, upon falling, it will set on fire anything inflammable near it. Red-hot shot are fired by putting a wet wad in over the dry wad next to the powder. The red-hot shot is then run into the gun, and rammed against the wet wad, and the gun fired in the usual way. The carcasses several times set fire to the enemy's works, but the use of the red-hot shot was reserved for a pressing emergency. A number of furnaces were constructed in the various batteries for heating the shot, which necessarily required a considerable amount of time to bring them to a white heat. News came in April that great preparations were making at Cadiz and other Mediterranean ports for a fresh and vigorous attack on Gibraltar, and that the Duc de Crillon, who had lately captured Minorca, would bring 20,000 French and Spanish troops, in addition to those at present engaged in the siege, that a large fleet would also be present, and that the principal attack would be made by means of ships turned into floating batteries and protected by an immense thickness of cork or other wood. On the 9th of May the ships began to arrive. Among them were 7 large vessels, which appeared to be old men of war. A large number of workmen immediately went on board them, and began to lower the topmasts. This confirmed the news in respect to the floating batteries. About this time, 3 store ships fortunately arrived from England, with powder, shell, and other stores. As there could be no longer any doubt that the attack was this time to be delivered on the sea face, strong working parties were employed in strengthening the water batteries, in erecting lines of palisades to prevent a landing from boats, and in building furnaces for the heating of shot in these batteries also. At this time, the engineers began to drive a gallery through the rock, facing the neutral ground, in order to place guns there. This work was carried on to the end of the siege, and the batteries thus erected are now among the strongest of the defenses of Gibraltar. At the end of the month a great fleet, consisting of upwards of 100 sail, entered the bay and anchored off Algeciras. Some 9 or 10,000 troops were landed, and, from that time, scarce a day passed without fresh vessels laden with stores and materials for the siege arriving in the bay. Early in May 12 gunboats that had been sent out in pieces from England were completed and launched. Each carried 1 gun and was manned by 21 men. 6 of these drew their crews from the Brilliant, 5 from the Porcupine, and 1 from the Speedwell cutter. These craft had been specially designed for the purpose of engaging the enemy's gunboats, and for convoying ships into the port. On the 11th of June a shell from the enemy burst just at the door of one of the magazines of Willis Battery. This instantly blew up, and the explosion was so violent that it seemed to shake the whole rock. 14 men were killed, and 15 wounded, and a great deal of injury done to the battery. But strong parties at once set to work to repair it. A few days later, a French convoy of 60 sail and 3 frigates anchored in the bay, and from these, another 5,000 French troops landed. At the end of the month, the Duc de Crillon arrived, and took command of the besiegers. A private letter that was brought in by a privateer that had captured a merchantman on her way gave the garrison an idea of the method in which the attack was to be made. It stated that 10 ships were to be fortified, 6 or 7 feet thick, with green timber bolted with iron, and covered with cork, junk, and rawhides. They were to carry guns of heavy metal, and to be bomb-proof on the top, with a descent for the shells to slide off. These vessels, which they supposed would be impregnable, were to be moored within half gunshot of the walls with iron chains, and large boats with mantlets were to lie off at some distance, full of troops ready to take advantage of occurrences. That the mantlets of these boats were to be formed with hinges, to fall down to facilitate their landing. There would, by that time, be 40,000 men in camp, but the principal attack was to be made by sea, to be covered by a squadron of men of war with bomb ketches, floating batteries, gun and mortar boats, etc., and that the Comte d'Artois, brother to the King of France, with other great personages, was to be present at the attack. At this time, the enemy fired but little, and the garrison were able to turn their whole attention to strengthen the points most threatened. The activity of the enemy on their offensive works on the neutral ground continued, and, in one night, a strong and lofty work 500 yards long, with a communication 1,300 yards long to the works, was raised. It was calculated that 10,000 men at least must have been employed upon it, and no less than 1.5 million sandbags used in its construction. There could be no doubt now that the critical moment was approaching, and that ere long the garrison would be exposed to the most tremendous fire ever opened upon a besieged place. End of chapter 16, read by gracesilvey. Chapter 17 of Held Fast for England by G.A. Henty. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by gracesilvey. Held Fast for England by G.A. Henty. Chapter 17. The Floating Batteries. In spite of the unremitting work of the daily cannonade of illness and hardship, life on the Rock had not been unpleasant to the O'Halloran's, although many of the officers' wives had, at one time or another, taken advantage of ships sailing from the port to return home, or rather, to endeavor to do so, for a considerable number of the vessels that left were captured by the Spaniards before getting through the straits. There still remained sufficient for agreeable society, and the O'Halloran's was, more than any other house, the general meeting place. From its position in the hollow, it was sheltered from the fire of all the shore batteries, whose long-distance shots searched all the lower parts of the Rock, while the resources of the establishment enabled the O'Halloran's to afford an open-handed hospitality that would have been wholly beyond the means of others. They had long since given up selling any of their produce, distributing all their surplus eggs among families where there was illness, or sending them up to the hospitals, and doing the same with their chickens and vegetables. The greatest care was bestowed upon the poultry, fresh broods being constantly raised, so that they could kill 8 or 10 couple a week, and still keep up their stock to its full strength. Thus, with gatherings 2 evenings a week at their own house, and usually as many at the houses of their friends, while Captain O'Halloran and Bob frequently dined at the mess of their own or other regiments, the time passed pleasantly. While Carrie was fully occupied with the care of the house and the general superintendence of what they called their farm, Bob was never at a loss for amusement. There was always something to see, some fresh work being executed, some fresh development in the defenses, while he was on terms of friendship with almost every officer in the garrison. It was 2 years and a half since he had come out, and he was now 18. His constant intercourse with people older than himself, and with the officers of the garrison, together with the exceptional position in which he found himself, made him, in some respects, seem older than he was. But he still retained his liveliness and love of fun. His spirits never flagged, and he was a general favorite with all who knew him. On the 19th of August, a boat with a flag of truce brought in a complimentary letter from the Duc de Crillon to the governor, informing him of the arrival of the Comte de Troyes and the Duc de Bourbon in his camp, and sending him a present of ice, fruit, partridges, and other delicacies. The governor returned a letter in similar complimentary terms, thanking the Duke for his letter and the presents, but declining with thanks the supplies that had been offered, saying that he never received for himself anything beyond what was common to the garrison. The sailors of the ship of war now pitched tents ashore, for their use when they should be ordered to land to take part in the defense, and the heavy guns were, for the most part, moved down from the upper batteries to the sea lines. Day after day passed, the bombardment being constantly expected, but the damage inflicted by fire on the enemy's works by our carcasses delayed the attack. On the 8th of September, a tremendous fire was suddenly opened, with red-hot shot and carcasses, upon the enemy's works. The Mahon battery was burned, while the San Carlos and San Martin batteries were so damaged that they had almost to be rebuilt. The enemy, as on previous occasions, showed extreme bravery in their efforts to extinguish the fire and to repair damages, and it was afterwards known that the French troops alone had 140 killed and wounded. The damage done probably convinced the Duc de Crillon that no advantage could be hoped for by trying further to increase his works, and, at 5:30 next morning, a volley of 60 shells was fired by their mortar batteries, followed by the discharge of 170 pieces of heavy artillery. This tremendous fire was kept up for some time, while 9 line-of-battle ships supported by 15-gun and mortar boats, passed to and fro along the sea face, pouring in their fire upon us. At nightfall, the enemy's guns ceased firing, but their mortars kept up their shell fire all night. The next day, the ships of war renewed their attack, as did the land batteries. In the course of the day, the Brilliant and Porcupine frigates were scuttled by the Navy alongside the New Mole, and their crews landed. On the following day, the enemy's fire was principally directed against the barrier and chevaux de frise in front of the land port, and, in the afternoon, these barriers and palisades were all in flame, and the troops at that end of the rock got under arms in case an attack should be made. On the morning of the 12th, the combined fleets of France and Spain, consisting of 38 men of war, 3 frigates, and a number of smaller craft, sailed into the bay and anchored near Algeciras. Their fleet now consisted of 47 men of war, 10 battering ships, considered invincible, and carrying 212 guns, and innumerable frigates and small ships of war, while on the land side were batteries mounting 200 heavy guns and an army of 40,000 men. Tremendous odds indeed, against a fortress whose garrison consisted of 7,000 effective men, including the Marine Brigade. For some days past, Bob had been engaged, with their landlord and some hired laborers, in bringing in earth and filling up the lower rooms 4 feet deep, in order to render the cellars bomb-proof. Some beds and furniture were taken below, so that Carrie, the servants, and the Spanish family could retire there, in case the enemy's shells fell thickly round the house. It was noticed as a curious incident that, just as the combined fleet entered the bay, an eagle, after circling round it, perched for a few minutes upon the summit of the flag-post, on the highest point of the rock, an omen of victory which would have been considered decisive by the Romans, and which did, in fact, help to raise the spirits and confidence of the garrison. On the morning of the 13th, the enemy's battering ships got under way, with a gentle breeze from the northwest, and at a little past 9 o'clock anchored, in admirable order, in line of the sea face. The nearest was about 900 yards from the King's Bastion, the most distant being about 1,100 yards. Not a shot was fired before the enemy anchored, and then the whole of the batteries that commanded them opened fire, to which the battering ships and the artillery in their lines at once replied. Bob was standing on the roof of the house with his sister. "What a magnificent sight, Carrie!" he exclaimed. "It is well worth all the waiting to be here to see it." "It is terrible," Carrie said. "It is like one great roar of thunder. How awfully the men must be suffering in the batteries." "I don't suppose it is as bad as it looks," Bob said. "At any rate, you needn't be uneasy about Gerald. All the troops, except those working the guns, are in shelter, and won't be called out unless the enemy attempt to land. I wonder their fleet don't come across to help their batteries. I suppose they are afraid of the carcasses and red-hot shot." "Well, there is one comfort, Carrie. None of their shot are coming this way. Their floating batteries, evidently, are firing only at our batteries by the water. As to the others, we know that we are safe enough from them, though certainly the shot do make a most unpleasant noise as they fly overhead. I wish there was a little more wind to blow away the smoke, so that we could see what effect our fire is having on those hulks. I shouldn't think that we had begun with red-hot shot yet. It takes 3 hours to get them hot enough. As far as I can see, whenever the wind blows the smoke away a little, our shot and shell roll off the roofs and sides without doing any damage to speak of." About noon, the enemy's mortar boats and kedges attempted to come across and assist their battering ships, but the wind had changed and had worked round to the southwest, blowing a smart breeze and bringing in a heavy swell, so that they were prevented from taking part in the action. Our own gunboats were hindered, by the same cause, from putting out and opening a flanking fire upon the battering ships. The northern batteries by the water suffered heavily from the fire of the Spanish lines, which took them in flank, and indeed, some of the batteries in reverse, causing many casualties. The artillery, however, refused to let their attention be diverted from the battering ships. By 2 o'clock, the furnaces had heated the shot in all the batteries, and, although some of them had been firing these missiles for upwards of an hour, it was not until 2 that their use became general. Soon afterwards, when the wind cleared away the smoke from the ships, men could be seen on their sloping roofs, directing streams of water from the pumps upon small wreaths of smoke that curled up here and there. Up to this time, the defenders had begun to fear that the craft were indeed as invulnerable as the Spaniards believed them to be. But these evidences that the red-hot shot were doing their work greatly roused their spirits, and cheers frequently rose as the men toiled at their heavy guns. As the afternoon went on, the smoke from the upper part of the Spanish admiral's flagship rose more and more thickly, and, although numbers of men continued to bring up and throw water over the roof, working with extraordinary bravery, in spite of the hail of projectiles poured upon them, it was clear that the fire was making steady progress. Bob had, long before this, gone down to the works by the sea face, where considerable bodies of troops were lying, in the bomb-proof casemates, in readiness for action if called upon, and from time to time he went out with Captain O'Halloran and other officers to see how matters were going on. In sheltered places behind the batteries, some of the surgeons were at work, temporarily binding up the wounds of artillerymen struck with shell or splinters, after which they were carried by stretcher parties of the infantry up to the hospitals. Dr. Burke was thus engaged in the battery where his regiment was stationed. He had, since the first bombardment commenced, ceased to complain of the want of opportunities for exercising himself in his professional work, and had been indefatigable in his attendance on the wounded. Among them he was an immense favorite. He had a word and a joke for every man who came under his hands, while his confident manner and cheery talk kept up the spirits of the men. He was, too, a very skillful operator, and many of the poor fellows in hospital had urgently requested that, if they must lose a limb, it should be under the hands of Dr. Burke. "It is much better to make men laugh than to make them cry," he would say to Bob. "It is half the battle gained when you can keep up a patient spirit. It is wonderful how some of them stand pain. The hard work they have been doing is all in their favor." Bob several times went out to him and assisted him as far as he could by handing him bandages, sponges, etc. "You ought to have been an assistant from the beginning, Bob," he said. "By this time you would have been quite a decent surgeon. Only you have a silly way of turning pale. There, hand me that bandage." "All right, my man, we will have you patched up in no time." "No, I don't think you can go back to your gun again. You will have to eat and drink a bit and make fresh blood before you will be much use at a 32-pounder again." "What is this, a scalp wound?" "Splinter of a shell, eh? Well, it is lucky for you, lad, that you have been hardening your skull a bit before you enlisted. A few clips from a blackthorn are capital preparation. I don't think you will come to much harm. You are not more hurt than you would be in a good lively faction fight. There, you had better put down that sponge, Bob, and go into the casemate for a bit. You are getting white again." "I think we are over the worst now, for if, as you tell me, the smoke is beginning to come up from some of those floating batteries, their fire will soon slacken a bit. As long as they keep out the shot, those defenses of theirs are first-rate, but as soon as the shot begin to embed themselves in the roof, they are worse than nothing, for they can neither dig out the shot nor get at them with the water. Once establish a fire, and it is pretty sure to spread." Bob was glad to get back again into the bomb-proof casemates, for there was comparative quiet, while outside, the constant roar of the guns, the howl of shot, the explosion of shell, and the crash of masonry created a din that was almost bewildering. Presently a cheer was heard in the battery, and Bob went out to see what it was, and returned with the news that the ship next to the Spanish admiral's was also smoking in several places. As the afternoon went on, confusion was apparent on board several of the battering ships, and, by the evening, their fire had slackened considerably. Before 8 o'clock it had almost entirely ceased, except from 1 or 2 ships to the northward of the line, which, being somewhat farther from the shore, had suffered less than the others. At sunset, the artillery in our batteries were relieved, the naval brigade taking their place, and the fire was continued, without relaxation. As soon as it became dark, rockets were fired by several of the battering ships. These were answered by the Spanish men of war, and many boats rowed across to the floating batteries. By 10 o'clock the flames began to burst out from the admiral's battering ship, and by midnight she was completely in flames. The light assisted our gunners, who were able to lay their cannon with as much accuracy as during the daytime, and the whole rock was illuminated by the flames. These presently burst out vigorously from the next ship, and, between 3 and 4 o'clock, points of light appeared upon 6 of the other hulks. At 3 o'clock, Brigadier Curtis, who commanded the Naval Brigade encamped at Europa Point, finding that the sea had gone down, manned the gunboats and rowing out for some distance, opened a heavy flanking fire upon the battering ships, compelling the boats that were lying in shelter behind them to retire. As the day broke, he captured 2 of the enemy's launches, and, finding from the prisoners that there were still numbers of men on board the hulks, rowed out to rescue them. While he was employed at this work, at 5 o'clock, one of the battering ships to the northward blew up with a tremendous explosion, and, a quarter of an hour later, another in the center of the line also blew up. The wreck was scattered over a wide extent of water. One of the gunboats was sunk, and another seriously injured, and the brigadier, fearing other explosions, ordered the boats to draw off towards the town. On the way, however, he visited 2 of the other burning ships and rescued some more of those left behind, landing in all 9 officers, 2 priests, and 334 soldiers and seamen. Besides these, 1 officer and 11 Frenchmen had floated ashore the evening before on the shattered fragments of a launch. While the boats of the Navy were thus endeavoring to save their foes, the land batteries, which had ceased firing on the previous evening, again opened on the garrison. But as, from some of the camps, the boats could be perceived at their humane work, orders were dispatched to the batteries to cease fire, and a dead silence succeeded the din that had gone on for nearly 24 hours. Of the 6 battering ships still in flames, 3 blew up before 11 o'clock. The other 3 burned to the water's edge, the magazines having been drowned by the Spaniards before they left the ships in their boats. The garrison hoped that the 2 remaining battering ships might be saved, to be sent home as trophies of the victory, but about noon, one of them suddenly burst into flames and presently blew up. The other was examined by the men of war boats and found to be so injured that she could not be saved. She was accordingly set fire to and also destroyed. Thus the whole of the 10 vessels that were considered by their constructors to be invincible were destroyed. The loss of the enemy in killed and prisoners was estimated at 2,000, while the casualties of the garrison were astonishingly small, consisting only of 1 officer and 15 non-commissioned officers and men killed, and 5 officers and 63 men wounded. Very little damage was done to the works. It is supposed that the smoke enveloping the vessels prevented accurate aim. The chief object of the attack was to silence the king's bastion, and upon this 2 of the largest ships concentrated their fire, while the rest endeavored to effect a breach in the wall between that battery and the battery next to it. The enemy had 300 heavy cannon engaged, while the garrison had 106 cannon and mortars. The distance at which the batteries were moored from the shore was greatly in favor of the efforts of our artillery, as the range was almost point blank, and the guns did not require to be elevated. Thus, the necessity for using 2 wads between the powder and the red-hot balls was obviated, and the gunners were able to fire much more rapidly than they would otherwise have done. The number of the Spanish soldiers on board the battery ships was 5,260, in addition to the sailors required to work the ships. Great activity was manifested by the Spaniards on the day following the failure of their bombardment, and large numbers of men were employed in bringing up fresh ammunition to their batteries. Many of the men of war also got under way. Major Harcourt, Dr. Burke, and 2 or 3 other officers stood watching the movements from the O'Halloran's terrace. "I should have thought that they had had enough of it," Dr. Burke said. "If those battering ships couldn't withstand our fire, what chance would their men of war have? See, they are just as busy on the land side, and the 71st has been ordered to send down extra guards to the land port. I should have thought they had given it up as a bad job this time." "I have no doubt they have given it up, Doctor," Major Harcourt said, "but they are not likely to say so just yet. After all, the preparations that have been made, and the certainty expressed about our capture by the allied armies and navies of France and Spain, and having 2 or 3 royal princes down here to grace the victory, you don't suppose they are going to acknowledge to the world that they are beaten? I should have thought you would have known human nature better than that, Doctor." "You will see de Crillon will send a pompous report of the affair, saying that the battering ships were found, owing to faults in their construction, to be of far less utility than had been expected, and that, therefore, they had been burned. They had, however, inflicted enormous loss upon the garrison and defenses, and the siege would now be taken up by the army and fleet, and vigorously pushed to its successful termination. That would be the sort of thing I would bet a month's pay. The last thing the Spanish commander will confess is that he is beaten, and I think it likely enough that they will carry on the siege for months yet, so as to keep up appearances. In fact, committed as they are to it, I don't see how they can give it up, without making themselves the laughing-stock of Europe. But now that they find they have no chance of getting the object for which they went to war, I fancy you will see, before very long, they will begin to negotiate for peace. The Major's anticipations were verified. For some time the siege was carried on with considerable vigor, from 1,000 to 1,200 shot being fired daily into the fortress. Their works on the neutral ground were pushed forward, and an attempt was made at night to blow out a portion of the face of the rock by placing powder in a cave, but the attempt was detected. The position of the garrison became more comfortable after a British fleet arrived, with 2 more regiments and a large convoy of merchantmen. But nothing of any importance took place till, on the 2nd of February, 1782, the Duc de Crillon sent in to say that the preliminaries of a general peace had been signed by Great Britain, France, and Spain, and 3 days later the blockade at sea was discontinued and the port of Gibraltar again open. Bob Repton, however, was not present at the concluding scenes of the great drama. Satisfied, after the failure of the bombardment, that there would be no more serious fighting, and that the interest of the siege was at an end, he took advantage of the arrival of the Antelope in the bay, a few days after the engagement, to return in her to England. He had now been 2 years and 8 months on the Rock, and felt that he ought to go home to take his place with his uncle. He had benefited greatly by his stay in Gibraltar. He had acquired the Spanish language thoroughly, and in other respects had carried on his studies under the direction of Dr. Burke, and had employed much of his leisure time with instructive reading. Mixing so much with the officers of the garrison, he had acquired a good manner and address. He had been present at the most memorable siege of the times, and had gained the credit of having, though but a volunteer, his name twice placed in general orders for good services. He had landed a schoolboy. He was now a well-built young fellow, of medium height and powerful frame, but he had retained his boyish, frank good humor and his love of fun. "I trust that we shall be back in England before long," his sister said to him. "Everyone expects that Spain will make peace before many months are over, and it is likely that the regiments who have gone through the hardships of the siege will soon be relieved. So I hope that, in a year or 2, we may be ordered home again." There was a great deal of regret expressed when it was known that Bob Repton was going home, for he had always been ready to do any acts of kindness in his power, especially to children, of whom he was very fond, and it was not forgotten that his daring enterprise in going out alone to fetch him fruit had saved many of their lives. Amy Harcourt's eyes were very red when he went up to say good-bye to her and her mother, an hour before he sailed, and the farewells were spoken with quivering lips. The Antelope evaded the enemy's cruisers near the Rock, and made a quick passage to England without adventure. She had made 2 or 3 good prizes up the Spanish coast before she put into Gibraltar on her way home. Captain Lockett, therefore, did not go out of his way to look for more. On arriving at Portsmouth, Bob at once went up to London by coach. He had no lack of clothes, having purchased the effects of an officer of nearly his own build and stature, who had been killed a short time before. On alighting from the coach, he walked to Philpot Lane and went straight into the counting-house. His old acquaintance Jack Maitland was sitting on the stool his father had formerly occupied, and Bob was greatly amused at the air of gravity on his face. "Do you wish to see Mr. Bale or Mr. Maitland, sir?" he asked, "or can I take your orders?" "You are a capital imitator of your father, Jack," Bob said, as he brought his hand down heavily on the shoulder of the young clerk, who stared at him in astonishment. "Why, it is Mr. Repton!" he exclaimed. "It's Bob Repton, Jack, sure enough, and glad I am to see you. Why, it is nearly 3 years since we met, and we have both altered a good bit since then. Well, is my uncle in?" "No, he is out at present, but my father is in the inner office." Bob strode into the inner office and greeted Mr. Medlin as heartily as he had done his son, and Mr. Medlin, for the first time since he had entered Philpot Lane as a boy, forgot that he was within the sacred precincts of the city, and for at least 10 minutes laughed and talked as freely and unrestrainedly as if he had been out at Highgate. "Your uncle will be delighted to see you back," he said. "He is forever talking about you, and there wasn't a prouder man in the city of London than he was, when the dispatches were published and your name appeared twice, as having rendered great service. He became a little afraid at one time that you might take to soldiering altogether, but I told him that I thought there was no fear of that. After you had once refused to take a midshipman's berth, with its prospect of getting away from school, I did not think it likely that you would be tempted now. No, the General told Captain Howard that he would get me a commission if I liked, but I had not the least ambition that way. I have had a fine opportunity of seeing war, and have had a jolly time of it, and now I am quite ready to settle down here." Mr. Bale was delighted on his return to find Bob. It was just the hour for closing, and he insisted upon Mr. Medlin stopping to take supper with him. Bob had written whenever there was an opportunity of sending letters, but many of these had never come to hand, and there was much to tell and talk about. "Well, I am thoroughly satisfied with the success of our experiment, Mr. Medlin," Mr. Bale said next day. "Bob has turned out exactly what I hoped he would, a fine young fellow and a gentleman. He has excellent manners, and yet there is nothing foppish or affected about him." "I had no fear of that with Bob, Mr. Bale, and indeed, Gibraltar during the siege must have been a bad school for anyone to learn that sort of thing. Military men may amuse themselves with follies of that kind, when they have nothing better to do, but it is thrown aside, and their best qualities come out, when they have such work to do as they have had there. Yes, I agree with you, sir. The experiment has turned out capitally, and your nephew is, in every respect, a far better man than he would have been, if he had been kept mewed up here these 3 years. He is a young fellow that anyone, I don't care who he is, might feel proud of." So Bob took up his duties in the office, and his only complaint there was that he could hardly find enough to do. Mr. Bale had relaxed his close attention to the business since he had taken Mr. Medlin into the firm, but as that gentleman was perfectly capable of carrying it on single-handed, Bob's share of it was easy enough. It was not long before he complained to his uncle that he really did not find enough to do. "Well, Bob, you shall come down with me to a place I have bought, out by Chislehurst. It is a tidy little estate. I bought it a year ago. It is a nice distance from town, just a pleasant ride, or drive up. I am thinking of moving my establishment down there altogether, and as you will have it some day, I should like your opinion of it. It isn't quite ready yet. I have been having it thoroughly done up, but the men will be out in a week or 2. Bob was greatly pleased with the house, which was a fine one, and very pleasantly situated in large grounds. "There are 70 or 80 acres of land," Mr. Bale said. "They are let to a farmer at present. He only has them by the year, and I think it will be an amusement to you to take them in hand and look after them yourself. I know a good many people living about here, and I have no doubt we shall have quite as much society as we care for." Another month, and they were established at Chislehurst, and Bob found the life there very pleasant. He generally drove his uncle up to town in the morning, getting to the office at 10 o'clock, and leaving it at 5 in the afternoon. On his return home there was the garden to see about, and the stables. Very often his uncle brought a city friend or 2 home with him for the night, and they soon had a large circle of acquaintances in the neighborhood. "I should like you to marry young, Bob," Mr. Bale said to him one day. "I did not marry young, and so you see I have never married at all, and have wasted my life shockingly in consequence. When you are ready to marry, I am ready to give you the means. Don't forget that." "I won't forget it, sir," Bob said, smiling, "and I will try to meet your wishes." Mr. Bale looked at him sharply. Carrie's letters were long and chatty, and it may be that Mr. Bale had gleaned from them some notion of an idea that Carrie and Mrs. Harcourt had in their heads. 3 years later, Mr. Bale remarked as they were driving home, "By the way, Bob, I was glad to see in the paper today that the 58th is ordered home." "Is it, sir?" Bob asked eagerly. "I have not looked at the paper today. I am glad to hear that. I thought it wouldn't be long, but there was never any saying. They might have been sent somewhere else instead of being sent home." I hope they will be quartered somewhere within reach, Mr. Bale said. If they are stationed at Cork or some outlandish place in Ireland, they might almost as well be at Gibraltar, for anything we shall see of them. Oh, we can manage to run over to Cork, Uncle. There will be no occasion to do that, Bob. Captain O'Hallahan will be getting leave soon after he comes over, and then he can bring Carrie here. And he smiled slyly to himself. He mayn't be able to get leave for some time, Bob said. I think, Uncle, I shall run over directly they arrive. Perhaps the firm won't be able to spare you, Mr. Bale remarked. It is my opinion the firm would get on just as well without me, for an indefinite time, Uncle. Not at all, Bob. Mr. Maitland was saying only a few days ago that you do quite your share of the work, and that he generally leaves it to you now to see country customers when I am out, and thinks the change has been an advantage to the business. However, if the regiment does go to Ireland, as is likely enough, I suppose we must manage to spare you. It was indeed soon known that the 58th were, in the first place, to be disembarked at Cork, and one day Mr. Bale came into the office. I have just seen your friend Lockett, Bob. I mean the younger one. He commands the Antelope now, you know. His uncle has retired and bought a place near Southampton and settled down there. Young Lockett came up from Portsmouth by the night coach. He put in at Gibraltar on his way home, and the 58th were to embark 3 days after he left. So if you want to meet them when they arrive at Cork, you had better lose no time, but start by the night coach for Bristol, and cross in the packet from there. It was a month before Bob returned. The evening that he did so, he said to his uncle, I think, Uncle, you said that you were anxious that I should marry young. That is so, Bob, Mr. Bale said gravely. Well, Uncle, I have been doing my best to carry out your wishes. You don't mean to say, Bob, Mr. Bale said in affected alarm, that you are going to marry a soldier's daughter. Well, yes, sir, Bob said, a little taken aback, but I don't know how you guessed it. It is a young lady I knew in Gibraltar. What, Bob? Not that girl who went running about with you dressed up as a boy. As this was a portion of his adventures upon which Bob had been altogether reticent, he sat for a moment confounded. Don't be ashamed of it, Bob, Mr. Bale said with a smile, laying his hand kindly on his shoulder. Your sister Carrie is an excellent young woman, and it is not difficult to read her thoughts in her letters. Of course, she told me about your adventure with Miss Harcourt, and she has mentioned her a good many times since, and it did not need a great deal of discernment to see what Carrie's opinion was regarding the young lady. Carrie has her weak points, as, for example, when she took up with that wild Irishman, but she has plenty of good sense, and I am sure, by the way she wrote about this Miss Harcourt, that she must be a very charming girl, and I think, Bob, I have been looking forward almost as much to the regiment coming home as you have. Regarding you as I do, as my son, there is nothing I should like so much as having a bright, pretty daughter-in-law, so you have my hearty consent and approval, even before you asked for it. And you found her very nice, Bob, eh? Very nice, sir, Bob said, smiling. And very pretty, Bob? Very pretty, sir. I never thought she had grown up so pretty. And her head has not been turned by the compliments that she has of course received? I don't think so, sir. She said her mind has been made up ever since I brought her back to Gibraltar. So you see, the compliments did not go for much. Well, Bob, I will write to Major Harcourt. I shall hand you over this place altogether, and settle down in my old quarters in Philpot Lane. No, no, sir, Bob said. But I say yes, Bob. I shall keep a room here, and I dare say I shall often use it. But I have been rather like a fish out of water since I came here, and shall be well content to fall into my old ways again, knowing that if I want any change and bright society, I can come down here. If I find I am restless there, which is not likely, I can buy a little place and settle down beside you. As I told you long ago, I am a rich man. I have been doing nothing but save money all my life, and though, as I then said, I should like you to carry on the firm after I am gone, there will, as far as money goes, be no occasion for you to do so. 2 months later, the 3 members of the firm went over to Cork, and there a gay wedding was celebrated. And when, at the termination of the honeymoon, Bob returned to Chislehurst, he found Captain O'Hallahan and Carrie established there on a month's leave, and a day or 2 later, the party was increased by the arrival of Dr. Burke. Mr. Bale lived for 20 years after Bob's marriage, the last 15 of which were passed in a little place he bought adjoining that of the Reptons, and before he died he saw 4 grandchildren, as he called them, fast growing up. General and Mrs. Harcourt also settled down in the neighborhood to be near their only daughter a few years before Mr. Bale's death. Dr. Burke remained with the regiment for some years, and then bought a practice in Dublin, but, to the end of his life, he paid a visit every 3 or 4 years to his former pupil. Captain O'Halloran obtained the rank of colonel, but, losing an arm at the capture of Martinique in 1794, he retired from the army and settled at Woolwich, where Carey was within easy reach of Chislehurst, having his pension and a comfortable income which Mr. Bale settled upon Carey. At Mr. Bale's death it was found that he had left his house at Chislehurst to Carey, and she and her husband accordingly established themselves there. Bob, to the end of his life, declared that, although in all things he had been an exceptionally happy and fortunate man, the most fortunate occurrence that ever happened to him was that he should have taken part in the famous Siege of Gibraltar. End of Chapter 17, read by gracesilvey. End of Held Fast for England by Henty.